All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donnie, and I am your host and moderator for tonight's much anticipated debate on full preterism. It is a privilege to have two experienced debaters, two true professionals, Chris Date and Don Preston, to engage this very important topic. Specifically, Chris and Don will be debating the resurrection of the dead. Gentlemen, I do appreciate you both offering your time for tonight's event. I do really appreciate it. I know how excited I am for this exchange and also how excited our audience is. But what I'd like to do before we get into opening statements and the debate itself is get acquainted. Let's break the ice a little bit, get to know you, gentlemen. And so, Don, why don't we start with you? Been a little while since you've been here. If I'm not mistaken, your last time here was for a similar debate with Pastor Anthony Aquino. Fantastic debate. And so how have you been, Don? And also a little bit about yourself and your ministry.
Well, yeah, it's great to be back. I really appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate Chris being willing to engage in this discussion. It is an important discussion. My name is Don Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I have three websites, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and eschatology.org. I've authored 35 books. I produce YouTube videos 3 or 4 days a week. I have 3 blogs / radio programs / TV shows. I stay plenty busy. I am, to be honest about it, having the time of my life, enjoying myself more than I ever have. I am married to my first wife, as a matter of fact, for almost 55 years now. We have 2 fantastic kids, and life is good. Ministry is good. Just having a wonderful time. And like I said, appreciate being on.
Well, it's my pleasure. Don, I appreciate that introduction. All of that is great to hear. I do have your channel and website linked in the description box for people to see and check out if they want to hear more from you. Chris, it's great to have you back as well. Been a little while since you've been here on the Standing for Truth debate platform. Last time you were here was for your debate with Dr. Shabir Ali on the deity of Christ. That was a fantastic debate as well. And so, Chris, how have you been? A little bit about yourself and also a little bit about your ministry.
Well, thanks, first of all, for hosting this debate. Because I'm going to jump right into my opening when the time comes, I'll use this opportunity to also thank my opponent, Dr. Preston, and all the audience for tuning in on every side of the debate. Thank you for tuning in. So, as you said, my name is Chris Date. I started doing public ministry back in roughly 2009, 2010 with a blog and then a podcast, and now YouTube videos and conferences and things. I'm most known for my work with a ministry called Rethinking Hell, which promotes a biblical understanding of hell as annihilation, where what's known as conditionalists, people who believe in conditional immortality. But I am passionate about a wide variety of topics, especially what I consider to be the essentials of the Christian faith, which I take to include the resurrection of our bodies, our physical bodies in the future. In fact, it was the doctrine of resurrection as the resurrection of our flesh that first got me into public ministry so many years ago, and so I'm really honored to have the opportunity to defend it today. You asked how I'm doing. I'm doing okay. For the past year and a half, roughly, my wife and I have been I've been caring for and supporting for my wife as she has been treated for brain cancer that we discovered that she had back in November of 2022. She has since gone into remission after chemotherapy and radiation, and she's feeling better and better and more herself every day. So we praise God for that and pray that the cancer will remain in remission. So because she's in remission, things are going real well. And the only thing that sort of mars our event here tonight is that we had to reschedule it for a couple of days because one of my adult sons had his truck broken into the night before or the 2 nights before the debate was originally scheduled. So I'm very thankful to both of you for being willing to reschedule for today. I'll leave it at that, and maybe in Q&A, if people have any other questions for me, I'll answer them.
Awesome. Well, praise the Lord for the remission.
Amen.
Prayers for you and your family.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being here. Glad to hear everything is taken care of as well from Monday. It just built the anticipation that much more, gentlemen.
That's right.
I got to say, I'm excited. I do appreciate the introductions. And for those that want to hear more from Chris, I do have his information in the description box as well, link to your website, link to your YouTube channel. And so allow me to go over tonight's debate format. We are having a formal debate here on the resurrection. And so we're going to be having 20-minute opening statements, followed by 10-minute uninterrupted rebuttals. Then we're going to have 30 minutes of cross-examination. That'll be broken up into 2 sections, 15 minutes each. Then we'll have 5 minutes of closing statements, followed by audience questions. So this is where we get you guys involved in the audience. We will be having a roughly 25-minute audience question. So please, if you do have a question, firstly, keep it on topic. Secondly, keep it respectful, as our guests have been generous with their time for tonight's debate. And let me know who the question's for. If it's a question for Don, let me know. If it's a question for Chris, please let me know as well. We're trying to get a healthy balance of questions for our guests tonight. And then do your best to tag me, either at Donnie or at Standing for Truth. And so with that, I think we're just going to get right into our first opening statement of 20 minutes. Chris, you are taking the affirmative for tonight's debate. Actually, what I'll do to make things easier, let me go over the more detailed proposition for you, Chris. That way you could kind of jump right into it. So the proposition is the individual physical bodies of those who have died in Christ will one day be raised from the dead, and along with the bodies of the saints still living, be made immortal so as to live forever. Chris, whenever you're ready, you have 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. There are 3 key affirmations contained within that somewhat lengthy debate resolution that you just read. Firstly, that our resurrection is physical and individual. Secondly, that it's in our future. And thirdly, that the bodies of saints, at least, will be raised immortal. And in defense of these affirmations, I'm going to offer a 5-fold positive case. Firstly, that the church has always affirmed our debate thesis. Secondly, that the Bible says saints united to Christ will be raised like he was. Thirdly, that God's good design for human nature is physical embodiment. Fourthly, that the cosmos will one day be beautifully restored, purged of all evil. And fifthly, that the case for the affirmative in this debate is simpler and less costly than the negative. So let's dive right into the first of these 5 arguments concerning church history. And here I want to argue that resurrection of the flesh has always been central to the Christian faith. The Reformation era confessions, like the Westminster and London Baptist Confessions of Faith, for example, written in the mid-1600s, say that all the dead will be raised up with the self-same bodies, the very ones in which they died, but they'll be transformed. Now, I start with the Reformation confession because my opponent might try to argue that, hey, look, just like the reformers were sloughing off centuries of unbiblical accumulated tradition, so likewise we, quote unquote, full preterists can do the same thing and just slough off centuries of accumulated unbiblical resurrection tradition. But this isn't going to work because, unlike my opponent, the reformers had first and second and third century fathers and beyond to whom they could point as support for their belief concerning resurrection. So, for example, Irenaeus in around 180 AD says in his The Rule of Faith, what is sometimes thought to be one of the earliest creeds within Christendom, writes that the church has received this faith in one Christ Jesus and his manifestation to raise up all flesh, pasan sarka, that's Greek for all flesh of all mankind. Roughly 10 years later, in the Apostles' Creed, believers confirm or affirm belief in the resurrection of the body or flesh. The Latin here is carnis, the Greek is sarkos, both refer to the physical body. And another 20 years later, roughly, Tertullian writes in On the Resurrection that it would be better for heretics to acknowledge the resurrection of the flesh. Indeed, nobody will be a Christian who denies this doctrine, which is confessed by Christians. So from the beginning, right through the Reformation era and into the modern day, the church has always affirmed belief in a future bodily physical resurrection from the dead. By contrast, if I'm not mistaken, a belief in a first century non-physical resurrection was first promoted in the 1800s by James Stuart Russell. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, that my opponent takes this even a step further. In a video, the link to which you can find on the screen right now, he says that it scares me to death that I cannot find at least the germ stated by some other writer before me. He even says that not even J. Stuart Russell, who had written, again, back in the 1800s, considered the idea that I'm going to present to you here today. So in contrast to the negative in this debate, which is, as far as history can tell, a very recent novelty, the church, by contrast, has always, since the beginning, expected a physical resurrection unto immortality. We turn now, secondly, to the topic of Christology. And we start with the observation that, according to Scripture, Jesus is the first of many to be raised like he was. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul calls Christ the first fruits of those who belong to Christ, in as much as he has been raised from the dead. The idea of first fruits being the first of a larger group to experience this. Paul says in Acts 26 that Christ was the first to rise from the dead, thereby implying that there would be others beyond him, after him. And Paul says in Colossians 1:18 that Christ is the firstborn from the dead. That's not over or of the dead, but specifically from the dead. So he is the first of many who will come out of the dead. Secondly, we observe that the Bible promises the saints a resurrection body like the one that Christ rose with. We see in Romans 6 that Paul says if we've been united with Christ in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. And what kind of resurrection is that? One in which, having been raised from the dead, Christ will never die again. Paul says in Philippians 3 that we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform this lowly body that we have to be like his glorious body. And the Apostle John, in his first letter, says in chapter 3 that we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him because we shall see him as he is. So we see all this biblical evidence and more that we will rise with a resurrection body like that of Christ. Now, before I continue, it's important to observe that the negative in this debate says that Christ gave up this resurrection body, the body with which he came out of his tomb. In fact, he, if I'm not mistaken, believes it was incinerated. So he says in his foreword to Alan Bondar's The Journey Between the Veils that it was necessary that Christ lay off the body of flesh to enter into what the most holy place, which he takes to be where he entered in his ascension. And if that weren't enough, he says on Facebook a few years ago that Christ became a sin offering. And the sin offering was required to be totally consumed. And so Christ's physical body was consumed, not in his death and then restored in resurrection, but after his resurrection in his ascension. So Christ no longer has a body. He is dead again. But contrary to what my opponent believes, the Bible says that the resurrection of Jesus, the resurrection body of Jesus, the likes of which we will also rise, is his physical body, the one that came out of the tomb after it came back to life after 3 days. This is in every gospel. In Matthew 27, the Jews accused Jesus of being an impostor who said that after 3 days I will rise. And so in order to prevent his disciples from making it seem as if he had risen, they order the tomb to be made secure. So they understood that the resurrection of Christ that he was claiming would happen would be the emergence of his formerly dead body out of the tomb. We see it also in the Gospel of Mark, in which Jesus says the Son of Man must be killed and after 3 days rise again. Here again, the resurrection is the return to life of his physical body. He says in Luke, see my hands and feet. He's here post-resurrection. He's talking to his unbelieving apostles. He says, a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. Thus it is written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead. So the resurrection body of Jesus is one that included flesh and bones. And it's in the Gospel of John. The other disciple who had reached the tomb first after Jesus had been resurrected, he goes in and he sees, and now he believes what the scripture had said, that Christ must rise from the dead. Again, the resurrection of Jesus is the emptying of his tomb. In Acts 2, Peter says that David spoke about the resurrection of the Christ back in the Old Testament when he said that the Christ would not be abandoned to Hades or Sheol, the grave, the place of the dead, nor did his flesh see corruption. So the resurrection of Jesus, of which the apostles were were witnesses, not because they saw something that happened to Jesus after he ascended, but to what happened to Jesus who came out of the tomb. Peter says, we are all witnesses. His body went into the tomb and would have seen corruption, but God raised it out of the tomb. This is all the physical body of Christ that it's talking about when it talks about his resurrection. When Paul is at the Areopagus, Mars Hill, at Mars Hill, when it was inaugurated, literature was read that affirmed the Greek belief that there was no way for people to come back from the dead. And that's why the philosophers at the Areopagus many of them anyway, mock Paul, because Paul said God has given assurance to us all by raising Jesus from the dead. They couldn't countenance the possibility of coming back to physical life. They wouldn't have had any problem with the belief that people go on living in some kind of disembodied existence, the way that my opponent believes is the case with Jesus since his ascension. But what they did have a problem with was a physical body coming back to life, and they mocked Paul for it. And none of this should come as any surprise, because the New Testament language of resurrection just means a physical body coming back to life. So we see that the author of Hebrews in chapter 6 speaks of the resurrection of the dead as an elementary principle of the faith. And then a few chapters later in chapter 11 says that women in the Old Testament received their dead by resurrection. What is he referring to? Passages like 1 Kings 17, in which Elijah brings a child back to life and returns him to his mother. This just is what resurrection is in the New Testament, the coming back to physical life of a body that had physically died. So what all of this leads to is the conclusion that the bodies with which we are resurrected must likewise be physical. So united to Christ, the Bible says, the saints will rise with a resurrection body like his. Turning now to my third argument from anthropology, the study of humankind, I begin by observing that as a living creature, man is physical. And this is something that God called very good. So we see in Genesis 2 that God forms a man from dust from the ground and then breathes into Adam's lifeless body the breath of life. And it's at that point and no earlier that this man becomes a living creature. So what it means for a human to be a living creature, a living being, is to be embodied physically and breathing. And after God creates humankind and everything there prior to them, God calls this creation very good. Later in Isaiah, in chapter 42, God is said to be the one who gives breath to the people who are on the earth. And then a few chapters later, in Isaiah chapter 57, God says, I'm not going to remain angry forever, because if I did, the breath of those who I have made would dissipate, would vanish, would grow faint. So the idea is that because God is not going to remain angry at his creation forever, the reason he isn't going to is because if he did, all breath in physical, breathing bodies would perish. So all of this is an indication that it is a very good thing that God loves for his human creatures to be embodied and breathing, and it would be a bad thing for them all to cease breathing. Next, we see that the Bible says that for human beings, at least, being dead is not a good thing. The author of Ecclesiastes says that he who is joined with all the living has hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, for they have no more share in all that is under the sun. So however you unpack what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying, he is saying that dead human beings are in a worse off state because they will no longer participate in what takes place under the sun, which is exactly what the negative in this debate believes will happen to dead saints. And then also Paul calls death an enemy in 1 Corinthians 15. He says that Jesus is going to destroy every power, the last one of which, the last enemy he will destroy will be death. So death is not, for human beings at least, a good thing. It's an enemy to God's intended purpose for humanity, which is to be embodied and breathing. Thankfully, this death is not the end of the story, because the tree of life in Genesis that would have preserved Adam and Eve alive indefinitely, but their access to it is revoked, guaranteeing their eventual demise, that tree returns in the eschaton for Jewish and Gentile saints. So we read that in Genesis 3, after Adam sins, God tells him, to dust you shall return. That's the dust body that he had breathed life into, no longer breathing and returning back to the dust whence it came. And then he says, and then he says, lest Adam reach out and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. And then the narrator cuts God off and says, therefore God sent him out of the garden. So the tree of life would have kept Adam and Eve alive forever, but God revoked their access to it, so they eventually died. But thankfully, that tree of life reappears in Revelation 22, where the saved have access to its fruit. In that same book, at the end of the Bible, in Revelation 21, God promises to wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. And here he's quoting from Isaiah 25:7-8, in which Yahweh promises to swallow up death forever, the veil that is spread over not Israel, but all nations, all peoples, all goyim, not just the Jews. He will swallow up death forever and wipe away tears from all faces, not just Jewish faces, but all faces. And so you put these pieces together and it's real clear. Our future, therefore, includes rising to lasting physical life so that we can once again fulfill this good purpose of being embodied and breathing. So God's good design for human beings, we've seen, includes physical life and embodiment. Fourthly, we turn to the area of eschatology. And here what I want to begin to observe is that the natural world God created sinless and peaceful. And in this state, he said it was very good. So in the Genesis narrative, he gives to both humans and animals every green plant for food. Okay, so you've got peace. There's no predation. And the author of Ecclesiastes says that in this state, God had made man upright. So there's no sin. And it's in this peaceful and sinless state that creation is called very good. Unfortunately, because of Adam's sin, the natural world was plunged into futility. That is, the failure to fulfill the purpose for which it was designed. And so we see God once again telling Adam after he sins that cursed is the ground because of you. It's no longer going to easily produce food for you to get from the ground. And then after the flood, whereas previously humans and animals were not allowed to prey on each other, now the fear of humankind is on every beast, and every moving thing should be food for humans. Predation is now acceptable, tolerable, at least for the time. And this is what Paul is alluding to, or at least the Genesis 3 passage is what Paul is alluding to in Romans 8:20 when he says that creation was subjected to futility. Now, it's worth observing here at this point before I continue that the negative in this debate, if I'm not mistaken, says that sin, pain, and death will go on forever here on earth. Forever. He says in his short shot, The Redemption of Creation, that it's wrong to posit a cosmological transformation to an Edenic utopia. And though I can't find him writing on this more specifically, I will quote a fellow preterist known as Ken Gentry, who says that hyper-preterists see the world and history continuing forever and ever and ever and ever. They have no final removing of sin from the universe. God will always and forever have a fallen, sinful universe. This picture that includes the robbery of my son's goods from his truck, and that includes the cancer that my wife fought, those and so many other dark realities are an everlasting reality on this earth, according to my opponent, if I'm not mistaken. But by contrast, the scripture indicates that the saints' future resurrection is linked to a restoration of the natural world. Paul says in Romans 8 that the creation was subjected to futility, but it was done so in order that it would one day be set free when we achieve the thing that we've been eagerly awaiting for, the redemption of our bodies. And importantly, this restoration promised awaits the risen Jesus' return from heaven. In Acts chapter 3, Peter says that Jesus must be received by heaven until the time for restoring all the things about which God had spoken. So yes, Jesus is still in heaven, but when he returns from heaven is when the restoration of all things will happen, including the restoration of the natural order and the physical resurrection of the saints from the dead. So biblically, saints rising immortal is part of the beautiful restoration of all creation. Now I turn finally to the issue of parsimony. And I want to begin by just cautioning the audience here. This isn't a debate only about the nature of resurrection, which is what I'm focusing on. It's also about the timing of resurrection, which I believe is what my opponent is going to focus on. You see, the texts that talk about the nature of the resurrection body, as I've shown, and there are plenty of others that support this, seem to indicate that the resurrection will be physical. And this has got to be reconciled with timing texts that seem to indicate that this and other events were to happen soon. And my opponent and I take two different approaches to reconciling these two bodies of texts. I read the time texts through the lens of the nature text because I think the time texts are difficult, the nature texts are very easy. My opponent does it in the reverse, reading the nature texts through the lens of timing texts. And what I want to encourage you, audience, is to consider that the issue of parsimony can help us decide which of these reconciliation attempts we should prefer. See, my case is a very simple one. The church has always affirmed our debate thesis: saints will be united to Christ the way that Christ was raised. God's good design for humans is physical embodiment, and the cosmos will be beautifully restored, purged of evil. This is also a very economical, meaning not costly case, because it's ecumenical, able to be affirmed by people of every eschatological stripe, including preterists like me, every millennial stripe, including amillennialists like me, every view of anthropology, both dualists and physicalists like me, and even on the topic of hell, this in my case is something that can be affirmed by believers in eternal torment, universalists, and annihilationists like me. But now consider the tortuous case that I think you're going to hear from my opponent for a first century resurrection, quote unquote. He's going to say, well, if you look at this text over here, it has similar language as this text over here, so they're going to happen at the same time. And then you kind of bring in this other text over here that also seems to talk about this similar language. And, you've got this typology of the Mosaic covenant with the sin offering being burned up. And then you connect that to the fact that Jesus is the sin offering in the New Testament. And then you put that together with this text over here and then that text over here. And what do you get? It's all 70 AD. This is a very tortuous case compared to the beautiful and simple and elegant case for a physical resurrection. But more importantly than that, the cost to the faith of a first century quote-unquote resurrection is disastrous. It means that spirit-given teachers have universally failed to see this view for some 1,800 years or more. It means that Jesus' resurrection body was incinerated when he ascended to heaven. He died a second time. His heart stopped beating a second time. It would mean that the Gnostics rightly assessed the material world, at least in as much as physical bodies are superfluous to humanity. And it would mean, as we've already observed, that evil, pain, grief, and dying, the darkest realities on this world, are everlasting realities in this world. So I propose that affirming the case for a future physical resurrection is simpler and less costly than denying it is in favor of a past non-physical quote-unquote resurrection. So what we've seen is that, firstly, the church has always affirmed our debate thesis. Secondly, the Bible says saints united to Christ will be raised like he was. Thirdly, the Bible says God's good design for humans is physical embodiment. Fourthly, the Bible says that the cosmos will one day be beautifully restored, purged of evil. And fifthly, the affirmative case in this debate is simpler and less costly than the negative. And for all of these reasons and many others, I urge our audience to answer today's debate thesis in the affirmative. The individual physical bodies of those who have died with Christ will indeed one day be raised from the dead, and along with the bodies of saints still living, be made immortal so as to live forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that 20-minute opening statement to the audience. I am all caught up on your questions that have come in. I do appreciate the engagement in our live chat. And Don Preston, we're now going to hand it over to you. Okay. Allow me to restart the timer. And whenever you're ready.
Well, how do I get my screen up here so that I can use my PowerPoint?
Yeah, so if you're on the StreamYard and you look down at the bottom, it should say present right next to the settings button.
Okay.
So once you click, it'll give you several options, though. You'll want to make sure to click the share screen option. It's the last option after you click present.
Okay. Well, I was afraid of this. I was afraid there would be a little bit of there we are. Now then, it's all down at the bottom. There we are.
There we go. We look good.
Wow. Okay, are we ready?
Yes, we're good to go. Don, you have 20 minutes and the floor is yours.
Very good. Well, I want to say I appreciate what Chris had to say. Obviously, I disagree with him vehemently, but that's what the purpose of this debate is. I can't wait until I get into answering some of what he said. Now, when Chris discusses resurrection, he admits that Paul cited Isaiah, Hosea, and drew on Daniel chapter 12. However, I believe that Chris ignores the actual context, the nature of the resurrection, and the timing of those resurrection. He assumes, and you saw it in his presentation, with no exegesis, that they spoke of physical resurrection of individuals out of the dirt. So my presentation is going to establish the present or the proper context, the framework, and the timing of the resurrection as taught by those prophecies. Now, Chris says timing is difficult, nature is not. I challenge that. So I want to present to you the idea that Chris has a severe problem. Chris says that the resurrection occurs at the coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel. Romans 11:15, Romans 11:25 to 27. I concur with that 100%. But according to Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27, that coming would be in fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel. Inciting directly Isaiah chapter 59, that coming of the Lord to take away Israel's sin would be, this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. This means that God's old covenant with Israel remains valid until the resurrection. So I will need Chris to answer at some point during this debate, does Chris believe that God currently has one covenant for Israel, physical Israel, and another covenant for the church? Because you see, folks, if 1 Corinthians 15 and the resurrection, whatever the nature of that resurrection, is not fulfilled, then God does indeed have two covenant people. So we ask the question, why discuss Israel? We discuss it because resurrection was the hope of Israel. And you'll notice that Chris didn't mention this issue, but this is absolutely foundational. Resurrection was the hope of Israel, the 12 tribes, Acts 24:14, 26:6, 28:16. The passages that Paul cites for the resurrection and the salvation of Israel, Isaiah 25:8, Hosea 13:14, Daniel 12, Isaiah 27:9, Isaiah 59, were all Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And each one of those promises was now I want everyone to pay very careful attention. Each of those promises was about the restoration of Israel under the Messiah, restoration from exile, sin, death, alienation from God. They were not about a modern physical restoration of a rebellious, disobedient Israel or some imaginary end of time. Notice scholar Brant Petrie, in his magnificent book, Jesus, Tribulation, and the End of Exile, commenting on Daniel chapter 12 says, quote, this prophecy of the resurrection and justification of the many, notice the quote here, like all resurrection texts in the Old Testament, is also a prophecy of the restoration of Israel. Now, we could allude to the writings of Wright, Nanos, McKnight, and Holland, who all say the same thing. In other words, all of these Old Testament promises of the resurrection were not promises of the raising of individual human corpses. Thus, unless Chris can prove that Paul and the New Testament writers were radically redefining the hope of Israel from corporate death to individual bodily resurrection, then the foundation of his entire presentation falls to the ground. So let's look at some passages here, and I'm going to present the positive case of what the texts actually say. I'm going to compare it with what Chris has said to me in response to written questions. Now, Chris posits Israel's salvation, the taking away of her sin, Romans 11:27, at the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Well, Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, confined the taking away of Israel's sin to the 70 weeks. 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your holy city to take away sin. In answer to my question, Chris admitted Daniel's 70 weeks were completed in the first century. Well, folks, that means logically, Israel's salvation, that is the resurrection of Romans 11 and 1 Corinthians 15, were fulfilled in the first century. This absolutely cannot be ignored. Yet once again, Chris began in the middle. He wanted to talk about history. He wanted to talk about tradition and what have you, instead of what the Bible actually says. Now watch. Look at Romans 11 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Once again, Chris posits Romans 11 at the time of the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15. And Paul said the salvation of Israel would be in fulfillment of Isaiah 26 and 27, the time of the taking away of Israel's sin, which is posited emphatically at the judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood, at the destruction of the city and temple, and the destruction of the people that God, or that had rejected God. Isaiah 59, the taking away of Israel's sin would be in fulfillment of God's covenant with her, as we've just seen, at the judgment of Israel, when God judged her for shedding innocent blood. More on that in a moment. And again, Daniel chapter 9. But Chris isolates Romans 11 from its prophetic context and applies Romans 11, and thus 1 Corinthians 15, to time and events having nothing whatsoever to do with the actual fulfillment of what those prophecies actually said. Now let's look at the issue of the resurrection in regard to the law of Moses. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be at the end of the law that is the strength of sin. 1 Corinthians 15, 55 and 56. That's what the text says. I asked Chris to specifically define what is the law that is the strength of sin in 1 Corinthians 15, and he said, it is the law of Moses that ended in AD 70. Therefore, the resurrection was in AD 70. I suggest to you that upon this argument alone, ladies and gentlemen, Chris has totally surrendered his futurist view of the resurrection. Resurrection would be at the law that was the strength of sin. The law that was the strength of sin was the law of Moses, Chris' date. Therefore, the resurrection was in AD 70. Now, I want to move to an issue that is absolutely interrelated both in nature and in time to the subject of the resurrection, and that is the Great Tribulation and the resurrection. Now, Chris agrees that Matthew chapter 24 and 21, the prediction of the Great Tribulation, was in the first century in the Jewish war because of verse 34. This is absolutely fatal to his view of resurrection. Why? Well, let me quote Brad Petrie again in his book, in which he says, quote, according to the Old Testament, the resurrection itself would be preceded by a period of great tribulation, according to Daniel chapter 12, which is the most explicit prophecy of resurrection in the Hebrew books of the Old Testament. And strikingly, this description of the resurrection is preceded by the Great Tribulation. So let's develop this. All prophecies of the resurrection are inseparably linked to the Great Tribulation. But the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century at the time of the Jewish war. Chris' date agrees. Therefore, the resurrection was to occur in the first century at the time of the Jewish war. So unless Chris wants to insert a dispensational gap between the tribulation and the resurrection, this demands that the resurrection was in the first century, unless he wants to posit another great tribulation associated with the resurrection. Now let's break down a passage I've already mentioned and that Chris mentioned, and that's Isaiah 25, but we'll go all the way through verse 9. In verses 1 to 3, we find the destruction of the city and the temple. The city and the temple are turned over to foreigners, and Isaiah praises the Lord, and he says, you have made a city a ruin, a fortified city a ruin, a palace of foreigners to be a city no more. Folks, this is nothing less than the tribulation. But guess what? In Isaiah 25 and verse 6, we have the resurrection banquet, and Chris agrees with that. In verse 8, we have the resurrection that found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Chris agrees with that. Well, in verse 9, we have the salvation of Israel. In that day, it shall be said, in what day? Resurrection, messianic banquet. It shall be said, this is our God. We have waited for him. He's our salvation. So what do we find? We have the destruction of the city and the temple, the tribulation, that is tied directly to the messianic banquet and the resurrection and the salvation of Israel. And once again, Chris Date agrees that the tribulation was in the first century, but that's not all. Consider the messianic resurrection banquet. In Isaiah chapter 65, the Lord said, and speaking of Israel in her last days, my servant shall eat, you shall be hungry, my servant shall drink, you shall be thirsty, my servant shall sing for joy of heart. Isaiah 65, 11 and following. And he said to O covenant Israel, the corporate body, the Lord God shall slay you, you will all bow down to the slaughter, but there'll be the salvation of the remnant. Isaiah 65, 6 and following. But watch, in Matthew chapter 8, 11 and following, Jesus, commending the centurion for his faith, said, many shall come from the east and the west and shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom, and the sons of the kingdom shall be cast out. Now, I asked Chris if Matthew chapter 8, 11 and following was fulfilled, and if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were currently sitting at the resurrection banquet, and he said no, because he believes that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have to be raised out of the dirt to sit at that kingdom banquet. But wait a minute. Isaiah 25, Isaiah 65, and Matthew 8 all posit that resurrection at the destruction of Israel when, quote, the sons of the kingdom are cast out. Now, folks, that's not difficult to understand. It's not technical. It's clear. And we are told by Paul in Galatians chapter 4, 22 and following, that old covenant Israel was to be cast out. They had not yet been cast out. Chris doesn't believe they had already been cast out when Galatians 4 had been written, but they would be cast out for persecuting the new covenant seed of Israel. So what do we have? The Messianic banquet of Isaiah 25, of Isaiah 65, of Matthew chapter 8 would be established when the sons of the kingdom were cast out, when old covenant Israel would all bow down to the slaughter. Now let's look at Isaiah chapter 26 and tribulation and resurrection. Verse 14. Now we're told here about the nature of resurrection, the nature of it. The wicked nations would not rise. Isaiah speaks, or Yahweh speaks, of the nations, and he says they, that's nations, that's corporate. They are dead. They will not live. They are deceased. They will not rise. Oh, but wait, verse 16 through 18. What do we find? We find the tribulation. Lord, in trouble they have visited you. They poured out a prayer when your chastening was upon them. As a woman with child is in pain and cries out in her pangs. Folks, from Emil Schur onward, and many, many others far earlier than that, this passage was seen as a prediction of the messianic woes, the great tribulation. But what do we have in verse 19? Your dead shall live. Now, Chris says that's every individual body who has ever lived. By the way, on chapter 25, yes, death had passed upon all men because all men sinned. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Not just Israel. I agree with that 100%. But when would it be in Isaiah 25? When Israel was cast out, when the city was destroyed, when the temple was turned over to foreigners. So the resurrection in verse 19 here in chapter 26, your dead shall live together with my dead body. Now, many translations render that dead bodies, plural, and that's fine. But in Ezekiel chapter 37, which Chris' date applies to the national restoration of Israel, corporate resurrection of Israel, it mentions bodies, plural, and yet it's talking about the whole house of Israel being resurrected. But watch this. Verse 21, we find the avenging of the martyrs at the day of the Lord, when the earth shall cast out the dead. Scholars are widely agreed this is talking about the avenging of the blood of the martyrs. This is the avenging of the blood of the martyrs at the time of the resurrection that follows the great tribulation. Now the question is, when did Jesus say that all the blood of all the righteous would be avenged? Well, Chris just told us that time statements are difficult. No, they're not. Matthew chapter 23, all of these things shall come upon this generation. Chris understands that was the first century generation. Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, which predicted the coming, verse 29 and 31, predicted the coming of the Lord on the clouds of heaven. Chris Date understands that that's an easily understood time statement to be fulfilled in the first century. As a matter of fact, Chris Date has no problem whatsoever appealing to time statements when he's debating dispensationalists. And he says time statements have to be honored. But now when he comes to debating a preterist, he wants to say, well, time statements are difficult to understand. Well, let's move to the next passage. Hosea chapter 13, 1 and following. In Hosea 13, 1 and 2, we have death, the death defined. When Ephraim spoke trembling, he exalted himself in Israel. But when he offended through Baal worship, he died. Now they who? Those who died. They sin more and more. Now, I think Chris would agree with me that those who are dead cannot sin more and more. So what kind of death did they die? Well, the death that they died is explained back in chapter 6, verse 5. I, that's Yahweh, have slain them by the word of my mouth, but they were still living. Now, verse 12. The iniquity of Ephraim is bound up. His sin is stored up. The sorrows of a woman in childbirth shall come upon him. He is an unwise son, for he shall not stay long where children are born. Oh, but now what do we find? Here, that's tribulation, folks. But verse 14, I will ransom them from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. O death, I will be your plagues. O grave, I will be your destruction. So watch. The death to be overcome was not physical death. It was sin death. It was the death of Israel being sent off into captivity. Covenantal death. The tribulation in Hosea chapter 13 comes immediately before the resurrection. And the tribulation was in the first century. I don't know how I did that, but I'm not ready for that. So the tribulation comes immediately before the resurrection, and the tribulation was in the first century, according to Chris. Therefore, the resurrection was in the first century. We thus have the nature of the death involved, and Chris Date says the death of Hosea 13 to be overcome by the resurrection in Hosea 13 is the same death to be overcome in 1 Corinthians 15. Well, since Hosea chapter 13 is not about biological death, that's not what 1 Corinthians 15 is all about. So let's look at Daniel chapter 12. In Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. Jesus cites that verse in Matthew chapter 24, which Chris Date applies to the first century. Verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. When would this be? It would be at the appointed time of the end, the kairos suntelios. Verse 13, it would be the time of the rewarding of the dead and the prophets at the end of the days, the askatu hemeron. Verse 7 tells us when it would all be fulfilled. Now, Chris wanted to say in his debate with Michael Miano, well, we got an already but not yet. No, we don't have an already but not yet. One angel asked another in Daniel chapter 12, verse 6, when shall these things be? When shall all of these things be fulfilled? The other angel said, it shall be for a time, times and a half time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all of these things, not some of them, they wouldn't begin to be fulfilled. All of these things shall be fulfilled. What do we have? We have the tribulation, the resurrection at the appointed time of the end, and it was all to be in the first century, which was the appointed time. Thus, every single Old Testament text that Paul draws on for his resurrection ties the great tribulation to the resurrection, and it's a resurrection not of individuals, but of the nation of Israel. So here's the argument. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 is the resurrection of Isaiah 25 to 27, Hosea 13, Daniel chapter 12, and Chris Date agrees. But the resurrection in each one of these texts is at the time of the great tribulation. And the tribulation occurred in the first century in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem. Chris Date agrees. Therefore, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, unless it's a totally different resurrection from that in Isaiah, occurred in the first century in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem. This is absolutely foundational for understanding 1 Corinthians 15, and I suggest Chris has to deal with that, but you notice he didn't say a word about any of it. So let me summarize and conclude. I have shared with you the following. Chris Date's doctrine of a future salvation of ethnic Israel demands that Israel remains God's covenant people and the law of Moses remains valid. This demands that God has two covenants today with two covenant people right now. Furthermore, I've shown that Chris Date's admission about the time of the fulfillment of Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks demands that the time of the taking away of Israel's sin at the coming of the Lord at the time of the resurrection was in AD 70. I have shown that Chris Date's admission concerning the definition of the law as the law of Moses demands that the resurrection was in AD 70. I have shown that Chris Date's admission concerning the time of the Great Tribulation being in the first century demands that the resurrection was in the first century. So each of these admissions and doctrines is fatal to Chris's view of resurrection and fully establishes covenant eschatology. Now, let me conclude finally with this. According to Chris, the resurrection is when every human that has ever died is raised out of the ground. Well, guess what? Some at Thessalonica and Ephesus believed the resurrection had already occurred. So at some point during this debate, I want Chris Date to tell us, how would it be possible for anyone to convince anyone that the end of time had happened yesterday, that every person who had ever lived is reconstituted, resurrected, restored to physical life, happened yesterday or at any time in the past? The fact is, Paul never corrected the concept of the nature of the day or the resurrection, just the timing. He clearly did not agree with the nature of the day, or he would have challenged Hymenaeus and Philetus. So the question is, why did he not use Chris's arguments? So Chris will need to tell us, how could anyone convince anyone that Chris's concept of the resurrection had already happened? Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Don, for that 20-minute opening statement. Gentlemen, that concludes our 20-minute opening statements for this debate. We're now moving into our rebuttal phase of the debate. And before we do, thanks for the presentations. I do appreciate the visuals and the work put into them. And so what we're going to do is hand it over to Chris. I'll restart the timer here. And we have 10 minutes for a rebuttal. The floor is yours. Go ahead. Oh, and just make sure to unmute, Chris.
You know, you are the host, so you could unmute me too.
I tried, but it said I couldn't.
Okay. All right. Then I was wrong. I apologize. All right.
No.
So 10-minute timer. Yeah. So I want to begin just by observing that what I said would happen is exactly what happened. This is what you got as far as a case for a first century quote unquote resurrection. And I do say for a quote unquote resurrection because you ask any Bible scholar who has studied the Second Temple Jewish texts and who has done research into like what the rabbinical text said and so on and so forth, will 100% tell you that the language of resurrection, the word anastasis, anistemi, does refer to a physical body coming back to life. And so it is wholly appropriate to call my opponent's view a first century quote unquote resurrection. And this is all you got. You got, well, if you go look at this text over here, and they use similar language, and it says that there's got to be this thing that happens, and it's got to be the exact same thing as this one over here. And then you can bring in this text and that text and this text and that text, and you load up a slide with all sorts of different colored fonts of sizes and colors of fonts. What you get is it's all 70 AD. And yeah, I agree. That's a one take on the timing texts, but is it a take that merits reading the nature texts through that lens? No, I don't think so. For one thing, there are a number of different ways that we could try to reconcile the challenges that my opponent offers to what the text of Scripture clearly states, which is that resurrection is individual and physical. For one thing, there's a well-known reality in Scripture of there being dual fulfillments of prophecies, a more immediate one and then a more ultimate one. So perhaps there was the resurrection language was used for a first century phenomenon, but then more ultimately a much longer future one. And we'll talk about that time span in a moment. It's also possible that the process of gathering the elect from the four winds is a process that began in the first century and continues until the end when God raises the dead. There's also the possibility that we could just give up preterism and accept futurism and explain away the time text the way that they do. And there's a whole host of other explanations as well. I'm just not going to go down this road because trying to piece together a positive case that looks like this does not warrant setting aside the clear and consistent and simple case for physical bodily resurrection. My opponent asked, how is it possible that Hymenaeus and Philetus, referred to by Paul in the pastoral epistles, how is it possible that they could believe the resurrection had already happened, since obviously all humankind didn't come out of the dead? Well, there are people even today that within the church that have mistaken understandings of the resurrection. Just because there were some people who identified with the Christian community and said and believed mistaken things about the resurrection such that they could think it happened already does not mean that therefore that's in fact the reality. And moreover, my opponent said that why didn't Paul just respond to them by pointing out the nature of resurrection the way that I've said it? Well, in the texts where Paul refers to Hymenaeus and Philetus, he doesn't go on to rebut their argument at all. He just dismisses them as gangrenous. This is one reason I'm so passionate about this topic, because my opponent's view is gangrene. It's putrid. It is rotting away at people's faiths. And no wonder it transforms your faith into something that's unrecognizable as Christianity. We talked about the disastrous cost of my opponent's view on the faith. And what you end up with is that Spirit-given teachers for 1800 years completely missed this obvious reality. You have the idea that Jesus' resurrection body was burned up when he was going up to heaven. You have the idea that physical bodies are superfluous to the good design for humanity. And you have the realities of pain, grief, evil, and dying going on forever. My wife's cancer, my son's car being broken into, those are the kinds of realities that my opponent's view says are going to be real here on earth for all eternity. So yeah, I'm not going to go down this road of trying to piece together this text and 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 say, oh, well, now I've got to reinterpret the entire Christian faith. through that lens is absolutely disastrous. Now, what I will do, though, is point to a few things that I didn't have time for in my opening. Firstly, in his discussion with the Sadducees, who didn't believe in resurrection, notice they believe in a resurrection that might entail embodied sexed people being married again. You see this in Luke 20, for example. The Sadducees give this story about a woman whose husband dies, and so she marries the husband's brother, and then he dies, et cetera, et cetera. And they ask Jesus, trying to catch him in a trap, whose husband is she going to be? And the way that Jesus responds initially is something that somebody could argue is consistent with my opponent's view, because he says that in the resurrection they won't marry or be given in marriage. But he doesn't say that's because they're going to be disembodied sexless souls or something like that. He says it's because they cannot die anymore. They will rise immortal, incapable of dying physically. And in fact, look what he goes on to say. He is proof of this future resurrection. He says God is the God of the living, and he's the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. Now, his point for a future resurrection is entirely demolished if what he's saying is that there was some sense right then and there in which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were alive. That would neuter Jesus's case for resurrection using this argument. If, on the other hand, what he's referring to is some kind of coming back to life that nobody here on earth can see, namely the patriarchs, I don't know what, going from Sheol into a disembodied paradise and reclining at the banquet or whatever, that nobody here can see, that there would be no way for this to be a proof to the Sadducees of a resurrection, because there would be no way for them to see the event he's describing take place. The only way Jesus' argument for resurrection in Luke 20 and its parallels, the only way that argument makes sense is if he's saying that the fact that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he's the God of the living, is proof that they will one day live again physically. Another thing I didn't have time in my opening to point out is that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul really makes it clear that the body that goes into the ground when I die is the body that comes back up. He says, what is sown, using the analogy of a seed representing my mortal body going into the ground, what is sown is perishable, but it is raised imperishable. It, that is this body that goes into the ground, comes back up in glory. It goes down in weakness, it comes up in power, so forth. Throughout this whole passage, Jesus is talking about the body of the believer that is mortal and lowly and weak, going into the ground dead, but coming back up alive and glorious and immortal. And that's why he says that the first man, Adam, became a living being, alluding to that passage in Genesis I pointed to, in which Adam became a living being when he started breathing, right? When God breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, that's when Adam became a living being. Why does Paul say that the last Adam, Jesus, became a life-giving spirit? Because that word spirit, pneuma, also means breath. Whereas Adam was the first man to start breathing and therefore be a living being, Jesus is the one who gives life. He is the breath, he is the breather who breathes life back into the dead bodies of believers at the resurrection. This whole thing is about the resurrection of the flesh, not whatever Don is talking about. Now, he pointed to Daniel, where at the close of his visions, Daniel is told, seal up your vision because the time is far off. And then in Revelation, John closes his vision saying, with being told, don't seal up your vision because the time is near. That's absolutely right. At the very least, the vast majority of Daniel's visions and of John's vision in Revelation must be fulfilled. But the idea that therefore means that everything in those visions must be fulfilled is absolutely ludicrous. Imagine if I came to you and I told you, hey, last night I had this dream and I'm confident it's prophetic. I'm confident God gave me this vision of the future. This happened, and then that happened, and this happened, and that happened, and all these other things happened, and all these other things happened. And then 1,000 years went by, and then the dead were raised. You would know. And then I said to you, now I'm sure that this stuff's right going to happen, like within our lifetime. you would immediately know I wasn't saying that everything I just got done saying would happen within the lifetime. You would know that that everything up until this very long period of time I referred to happen. I think that's going to happen in the near future. And the onset of that very long period of time would happen in our near future. But you wouldn't take that to mean that therefore by 1,000 years, I mean 37 years, as my opponent believes. No, the reality is that 1,000 throughout Scripture as a round number is always used to refer to at least that many years, if not larger. The fact remains that if you believe, as Don and I do, that the destruction of the beast and false prophet happened in the 1st century, then the defeat of Satan and the resurrection of the dead will happen for a very long time after that. So no, there just is no argument here for my opponent's view, except for the tortuous stringing together a variety of texts that, frankly, anybody who's watching is going to have a difficult time piecing together.
Chris, thank you very much for that 10-minute rebuttal. Don, we're now going to hand it over to you. Okay, and whenever you're ready.
Okay, let me...
As you're getting that going, Don, I'll let the audience know we got a ton of questions coming in. I am all caught up on it. And so I appreciate just how engaged and excited our audience is with this topic.
Well, I have so much that I want to cover that Chris brought up. Okay, let me do this. I think I'll only use slides initially.
Okay.
If it will ever process here. Here we go. Okay. Are we ready?
You're good to go. Don, you got 10 minutes on the clock.
Okay. Very good. Chris says that we ought to accept the united testimony, and all the Jews, all you have to do is go back and look at all the rabbinic testimony, all the Jewish testimony. It's all united. Resurrection means only one thing, as if the Jews believed in one single view. But the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, there was an extremely wide range of differing views among the Jews regarding resurrection. It is absolutely simply wrong to try to give the impression that all of the Jews, or of all of Judaism, believed in only one kind of resurrection, the raising of decomposed bodies. George Nicholsberg says Oscar Kuhlman's notion of a uniformity in Jewish belief about the resurrection of the dead is simply not borne out by the text. Resurrection of the body is not the standard mainline Jewish formulation among those who believe that God's power entails a transcendence of death. And he goes on, but I'll, for time's sake here. Not only that, Chris Karagunas, in the book, Immortality, actually it's a PDF, Immortality of the Soul, said there was no united Jewish view of the resurrection. Instead, there were some 5 to 6 competing views. There was the resurrection of just the righteous, found in 1st Enoch, the Psalm of Solomon, and the Pharisees. There was the resurrection of all Israel, of all mankind, of the reconstitution of the human body, for instance, in 2nd Maccabees. There was a denial of the resurrection found in the Sadducees, and there was the belief in the immortality of the soul instead of the body. And by the way, that belief was very, very widespread. But guess what? Chris rejects that view. So the point is, we cannot therefore speak, as Chris Nate does, of the, quote, Jewish view of man, or the Jewish view of the resurrection of body, as if that was a singular view. It simply was not. John Collins agrees with this. I could cite many, many other scholars, but time gets away very rapidly when you've only got 10 minutes. So I'll remove this, if I can do that, remove from the stage, and I will just simply continue. Now, it's rather amazing to me that Chris just absolutely scoffed, and he said, Preston just goes here and he goes there and he drags out this scripture and he puts them all together. Wait a minute. I thought Chris was a Reformed guy. And as a Reformed guy, you would think that he would believe in analogia scriptura, which is comparing one scripture with another, putting the combined testimony together to come to a proper conclusion. But evidently not, because he scoffed at me. And by the way, I didn't just use similarity of language. I pointed out text after text after text after text that tied the tribulation with the resurrection. And what did Chris have to say about any of it? All he did was ridicule it. Well, I would remind Chris that ridicule is not refutation. It has no probative value whatsoever. And so in regard to my presentation, he said, well, it's possible that that's one take on those texts, but he tells us there are all sorts of other possibilities. For instance, a dual fulfillment. Well, I wonder if Chris, therefore, would accept the concept of the dispensationalists who tell us dual fulfillment. You know, well, yeah, there might have been a tribulation in the first century, but we're waiting for the real one. That's Kim Riddlebarger's view, for instance. But where's the proof of that? I would point the audience, and I would ask you to consider this. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11. Paul, speaking of events under Old Covenant Israel's history, said, those things happened unto them, and they are types of us. And did you notice that Chris kind of scoffed at the idea? That's what these preterists do because they've got this convoluted system and it's type and antitype, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Paul's the one that sets forth the events and the people of Israel as typological of what was happening in the first century. But notice what Paul says. Those things happened unto them, and they are types of us, upon whom the ends of the ages. Well, that word ends there is telos, meaning goal. N.T. Wright, Scott McKnight, R.T. France, on and on. All of these men agree that what Paul is saying here is that the goal of all of the previous ages had arrived. Well, not according to Chris. According to Chris, well, you might have had kind of a minor fulfillment of the Great Tribulation. Maybe you had some sort of national restoration even, but it's not the real thing. So for Chris, the real goal of all of the previous ages is out in Paul's future, 2,000 years removed from the very time in which Paul said the goal of all the previous ages has arrived. And again, all he did was scoff at my presentation. And he says there is a clear-cut case for the physical resurrection. No, not really. And he tried to address the case of Hymenaeus and Philetus, and he says Paul never corrected them. Well, he certainly did correct the concept of the day of the Lord, which is the time of the resurrection. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, don't let anybody deceive you that the day of the Lord has already come, for that day will not come except the apostasy takes place and the man of sin is revealed. So Chris is simply wrong to say that Paul never tried to correct the false teaching of Hymenaeus and Philetus. He never. And you know, I find it interesting that Chris says there were all sorts of different concepts of resurrection. But wait a minute, he'd already told us there's only one. So which is it? But the point of fact is, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and in 2 Timothy chapter 2, the only thing that Paul addressed was the timing issue. So the question is very, very valid. How could anybody convince anybody that Chris's view of the resurrection, when every dead body of every human being has ever lived, and you notice he didn't try to answer that. He didn't touch that question top, side, or bottom. Now, he then argued, he gave us this very emotional ad hominem argument. Well, Preston and all these preterists, they say sin and death and all this kind of stuff, including my wife's cancer. And believe you me, I commiserate with that issue. My wife is a 2-time cancer survivor. I know the pain of that. I know the struggle of that. I know the trauma of that. But folks, that is not a biblical argument. The fact is, in Revelation chapter 21 and 22, a passage that Chris applies, quote, after the end of time, what do we find after the millennium? What do we find in the new creation? What do we find in the new heaven and new earth? Well, guess what? We've got sinners outside the city. We've got the nations outside the city, and they're invited to come into the city. That's evangelism. But most of all, we have dogs, liars, and those who work abomination still existing outside the city. And it doesn't say they're in the lake. It says they're outside the city. And it also says that the nations of the earth are outside. And guess what they get to do? They're invited to come into the city to do what? To find healing. So Chris just simply ridicules what I said without answering anything at all. And he says, I'm just simply not going to go down that road. And then he gave us this discussion of the Sadducees in Luke chapter 20. And I must confess it was both confused and confusing as far as I was concerned. Jesus never said one word about coming out of the dirt, did he? And he gave the impression, if I understood him correctly, perhaps he can correct me on this if it's not, he gave the impression that the only thing that the Sadducees were denying was physical resurrection out of the grave. That's simply false. Josephus tells us they didn't believe in life after death at all. So when Jesus said, in regard to the resurrection, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am not the God of the dead, but of the living. He was refuting the Sadducean concept that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were dead. I mean, biologically they were dead, but he was refuting the idea, which Chris Date holds, that when the dead are dead, they're just like Rover, who's dead. They're just dead all over. No, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were dead when Jesus spoke. I am the God of the living, not those who will live one of these days, but I am the God of the living. Now then, he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I do need to do this. I do need to, well, I won't do that. He says that which goes into the grave comes up. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 44, Paul says it is sown a natural body. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. I want to tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, this gives Chris incredible difficulty. Chris says the natural man is not the biological body. And I agree with that. It's a reprobate man. But wait a minute. Paul said the natural man is sown. That means it's buried and it's raised a spiritual body. Well, wait a minute. How can that be? There's no conversion in the grave. Chris believes that those who are in the grave are dead. They do not know anything. Yet Paul says the natural man is sown natural. It is raised spiritual. But in Chris's paradigm, that cannot be true in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And boy, I'm out of time.
Time flies by when you're rebutting opening statements, gentlemen. So good job to the both of you. We got a lot of points on the table for cross-examination, everybody's favorite part of these debates. We've now concluded our opening statements and rebuttals. Again, gentlemen, I appreciate the work and time you've put into this debate. So with that, we've got our first 15-minute cross-exam. Don just ended with his rebuttal, and so Chris, we will give you the floor for the first 15 minutes of cross-exam. Gentlemen, go ahead.
Great, thanks. And just as a heads up, Donnie, unlike with my opening and rebuttal and closing, I don't have my own timer going, so you'll have to let us know when my 15 minutes are nearly exhausted. Dr. Preston, was I right when I quoted you in that the preterist power weekend or whatever video in which you said it scares you to death when you can't find at least the germ stated by some other writer, and that includes not even J. Stuart Russell writing in 1878? Did I characterize you unfairly there, or did I get you?
Yes, that is a mischaracterization that came from Anthony Aquino, who made a blatantly false statement claiming that I claimed that I invented the 40-year millennium. I made no such claim whatsoever.
I'm sorry. Let me interject for a moment, just because it's my time to control right now, and obviously you'll be able to do the same when it's your time. But I didn't cite Anthony. I know
you didn't cite him.
Hold on, sir. I didn't. Not only didn't I cite or quote him, I didn't even refer to the little short that he snippet. I actually put the link up to your video, and I transcribed what you said in that video. And what you said in that video is, it scares me to death when I can't find at least the germ stated by some other writer. And then you said that not even J. Stuart Russell considered the idea that I'm going to present to you here today. So where did I mischaracterize you? I apologize if I did, but where did I?
You mischaracterized me because you failed to take note of the fact that the specific point was that I developed in that lesson, that is, that the millennium would be at the destruction of heaven and earth, which is spoken of 3 times in Revelation 6, Revelation 16, Revelation chapter 20. I cannot find that in any of the literature, J. Stuart Russell involved. I absolutely was not saying that I invented the idea of the 40-year millennium.
Okay, and I didn't accuse you of it. But I do want to ask you then, can you point me to anybody prior to James Stewart Russell who, within the church context, argued for a first century non-physical resurrection from the dead?
Actually, Eusebius hinted at it. Eusebius hinted at the fact because he said that it might be possible to identify the millennium as the period of the apostolic ministry. I don't have that specific quotation. I'll be glad to get it for you after the program's over, after the debate's over. And so Justin Martyr, likewise, even though he affirmed physical resurrection, he said that there were those who were, quote, faithful Christians who did not believe in physical resurrection. So this
okay,
gets back.
That's really good. Let's look at that. Can you point me to the text in which Justin Martyr says that?
I would have to. I'd have to get in.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I should have made a PowerPoint on it.
Okay. So then, if I understood you correctly, what you have in the way of Christians prior to James Stewart Russell affirming belief in a first century. Well, actually, let me back up a second. Did you say that Justin Martyr said of those faithful Christians that they believed the resurrection had already happened, or just that it was a non-physical resurrection?
Non-physical.
Okay. So then what I think I've heard you say is that you can't point to anybody before James Stewart Russell within the church who argued for a first century non-physical resurrection, and the closest you can point to are a hint from Eusebius and the alleged affirmation by Justin, and I say alleged just because we don't have the time here to verify it, that there were other faithful Christians who believed a future non-physical resurrection. That's what we have in terms of historical precedent?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Next question. When I was going through the Gospels and Acts and Hebrews, pointing out that wherever Jesus' resurrection is talked about, his rising, his anastasis, his anistemi, all of these texts talk about the Jesus' resurrection in the context of the physical body that came back to life and came out of the tomb. In fact, I even mentioned, actually, I'll talk about Hebrews in a second. So can you point me to anywhere in the New Testament where this resurrection language is used, not of the physical body of Jesus coming back to life and emerging from the tomb, but to something that happens beginning with or after his ascension into heaven?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding the question. Can you?
Okay, I can try to ask it differently. Sure. Would you agree that in the texts I quoted from, when they talk about Jesus' resurrection, what they're talking about is his physical body coming back to life and emerging from the tomb?
Yes, that is the primary focus of their references to Christ's past physical resurrection.
Okay, so just to be clear, do you agree that the resurrection of Jesus was the revivification of his physical body?
Absolutely.
Okay, next question. What does it mean then, or would you agree that at least some of the texts I cited or others seem to say that we will rise with the same kind of resurrection that he rose?
Because this is not a simple yes or no.
That's
because
okay.
Christ's resurrection was the first from the death of Adam. The death of Adam was not physical death. So Christ's physical resurrection was a proof positive of his resurrection out of the death of Adam.
Okay, I want to press you on that in a moment, but before I do, you already told me that when the New Testament talks about the resurrection of Jesus, it's talking about the revivification of his physical body. And so then when I asked you about texts that indicate that we will experience a like resurrection, you said, well, but it's not about that resurrection. It's about some other resurrection that Jesus experienced, which was resurrection from the death of Adam, by which you don't mean a physical death. So can you point me to where the New Testament uses the language of resurrection and rising to refer not to Jesus's physical body coming back to life, but to him coming back to spiritual life from having been spiritually dead, if that's what you mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate it. Let's go to Romans chapter 6. Paul says, if we've been planted together in the likeness of his death. Now, very clearly, they had not been planted in physical death.
No, but he had.
That's correct.
And
but
we are
now,
united to him.
But now they had been united with his death. But now he says, if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Now, since they're since the likeness
Wait,
of his
hold on.
death,
Let me pause you for a moment. So this resurrection is isn't Jesus' resurrection physical body? It's some other resurrection?
well, he explains it. The death that he died to sin.
He
So
died
now
to sin, right?
Pardon?
Yeah, he died to sin. And Paul will go on to say that when a spouse dies, the living spouse is no longer obligated to that spouse. So when you die to sin, that doesn't mean that you die a sin death or something like that. It means that you are no longer, you've died to sin. And certainly, I guess the question, okay, so I apologize. Again, are you saying that resurrection like his in Romans 6:5 is not referring to Jesus' physical body coming back to life?
I'm saying that our physical, when we're baptized into a likeness of his death, but we do not die physically.
Okay, I'll ask the question again because, with the utmost of respect, you don't seem to be answering it. I'm going to ask one more time. When Paul refers to a resurrection like Christ's, you're saying he's not referring to the revivification of Christ's physical body, correct?
That's lying in the background, but what he's pointing to is the spiritual significance of that.
Okay,
Christ,
well, okay. So you're saying that a resurrection like Christ's is the revivification of his physical body.
and that lies in the background of Romans chapter 6. But the real point of it is the covenantal death that he died. He died to the old covenant world. They died to the old covenant world, just like Romans chapter 7 says. You have become dead to the law by the body of Christ.
Okay, I understand, but I just want to reiterate. You're saying the resurrection of Christ that Paul refers to in Romans 6:5 is the physical revivification of Jesus's body.
It's included. I'm not denying that.
So
I'm focusing on the very specific language that Paul is using.
So it's my
likeness.
time.
I'm sorry.
No, you have nothing to apologize for, but I really do need to try to control the time. So resurrection like Christ, the word anastasis right there, is just like it is everywhere else that Jesus' resurrection is spoken of, is the physical revivification of his body. So why then does the exact same language of resurrection and rising, when it's referred to the saints, not refer to that, but not even include it? Because I think what you've just said is that the revivification of Christ's physical body at least is part of the resurrection that he's talking about. So then why is it that the resurrection language applied to saints doesn't even include that? Can you point me?
Like I said, because the physical is in the background, the spiritual is in the foreground. That is the focus. Just like Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection is specifically and emphatically called a sign. Well, the sign never points to itself. It points to something greater.
So we've seen that the word everywhere that the word resurrection and the word rise, referring to Christ in the context of resurrection, is the revivification of its physical flesh. You think that there's more beyond that? That's fine. I mean, we can talk about that. But that resurrection language is all about his physical body coming back to life. Let me ask you this then. When the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11:35 that women received back their dead by anastasis, what kind of resurrection was he talking about?
Well, I think that's a great question. He goes ahead to point out some women received their dead back. Why? Because they were looking for something better than physical resurrection.
No, I don't agree with that, but this isn't my time to answer your question. So if you want to press me on that, you can. Okay. But my point is, when the author says women received back their dead by anastasis, that was a reference to the revivification of physical life, correct?
Yes, but again, he points to the greater. Because obviously coming back to life and then dying again a bit later isn't as good as coming back to life immortal, which is the whole point of this debate. But let me ask you this. So earlier in Hebrews, when the author uses that word anastasis, the only other time, if I'm not mistaken, that the author of Hebrews uses that word, namely in Hebrews 6:2, in which he speaks of the elementary principles, including the anastasis of the dead. Is he using anastasis differently there than he does later in 11:35? Well, only context could do that. He is using that word anastasis in regard to the Old Covenant, primary doctrines of the Old Covenant.
My question again was, is the author of Hebrews referring in chapter 11 with the word anastasis to physical bodies coming back to physical life, is he using the word anastasis to mean something different here in Hebrews 6?
Hebrews chapter 6 doesn't give us insight into specifically what he has in mind.
That's fine. I'm asking you, what anastasis of the dead does the author of Hebrews in Hebrews 6 include among the elementary principles?
Since the author of Hebrews chapter 6 does not give us specific insight or definition of how he's using anastasis, then we might conjecture and say, well, it should be that of chapter 11, but we don't have enough evidence to definitively say they are the same.
Okay.
And when we understand how anastasis is used, for instance, in the text that I adduced in my first presentation, that were used of covenantal death and the corporate death, then we have every right to say, well, this is what's involved in Hebrews chapter 6 as well.
Okay, so just to be clear, every single time in the New Testament that the language of resurrection and of rising refers to Christ, it refers to the revivification of his flesh. And when the author of Hebrews uses the word anastasis in one of two places, and it clearly refers to revivification of dead physical flesh, all of that doesn't change the fact that when he uses the exact same word in Hebrews 6, and when the exact same words are used of saints, it not only isn't primarily the revivification of flesh, it's not that at all, correct?
Context rules. You have to look at every single text.
All right, let's move on to the body of Jesus. Did I misrepresent you? And if I did, I'm sorry. Sincerely, I may have gotten this wrong, but if I understood your foreword to Bondar's book correctly and to what you appear to have said on Facebook, you seem to say that the body of Jesus, the very body that the New Testament uses the language of resurrection for, that came out of the tomb, was incinerated on the way to heaven. Is that right?
I have made that comment. I've thought about it some more since then. I don't know that I would take that position.
Okay.
However, I would point this out. You seem to be ridiculing the idea that I said Christ was made a sin offering, but that's the very point of 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21. He, that is Christ, was made sin for us. The language there is he was made to be a sin offering.
Oh, I totally agree. But where I think you and I would disagree is on the significance of that, because I think the significance of the sin offering is in the death of the life that's taken, not the burning up of flesh. But that's fine. So you said you're no longer sure of what you've once said. That's fine. But at least
let me make one point of clarification, if I may, Chris.
Sure.
I do not deny, and I have never denied, that Christ has a body in heaven.
I know, but you don't believe he has a physical one, right?
Correct.
Right. So just to be clear, the physical body that came back to life and emerged from the tomb, which New Testament authors consistently use the word anastasis and anisteme to refer to, that body, Jesus in some way, shape, or form shed when he ascended to heaven, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Or was transformed.
Okay. Did he,
as I said, I've thought some more about that, and that's a view. You know, it's kind of like you when you said in your debate with Michael Miano that you might have to rethink the idea that there would be procreation. You know, all of us are prone to change. We should be willing to change when we rethink. So I would be willing to rethink that. But my whole point of it is that, and this is my position, the body that came out of the tomb before it ascended was completely, totally unchanged. I reject the idea that it was his transformed body.
That's fine.
One more question, Chris.
Okay. You said that I ridiculed you. I didn't. I was simply observing the impact of your belief on concerning resurrection on the rest of the faith. When I said that in your view, and this is my question for you, do you affirm that sin and pain and disease and sickness and death will go on forever here on earth?
Yes, I do. That's the picture of Isaiah chapter 25. There's death in the new heaven and the earth. I've already explained it in Revelation chapter 21 and 22. Outside the gates are the nations that are sin. They need to come into the city to find healing.
Okay, thank you. That's my time.
All right, gentlemen. Excellent, fast-paced first round of cross-exam. We now have another 15 minutes. Don, you get to lead the way for this round. Gentlemen, again.
Okay.
15 minutes. You're good to go.
Okay. Chris, I adduced several passages that specifically tied, seemingly so, the tribulation with the resurrection. Can you point to one of those passages that I used wrongly?
To be honest, I can't even follow how you use them. This was the point of my admittedly tongue-in-cheek graphic in which Charlie Day from the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is pointing to all the strings on the wall, right? Because I can't follow it. Now, if you want to spend your cross-examination time digging into them, we can certainly do that. But what I will say is this. I have no problem with the possibility that there may be multiple great tribulations. I'm not saying that's my position, but I am saying that if, for example, the maiden who will give birth to a son can have both a more immediate fulfillment in somebody prior to Christ and then an ultimate fulfillment in the virgin that was born in Mary's womb, from Mary's womb, so likewise there could be a more immediate fulfillment of a great tribulation that was in first century Judea and a future one accompanying the resurrection. And that's just one of many possible ways that I think could be used to reconcile those texts.
Okay. Paul said, as I've already noted, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, that the goal of all the previous ages had arrived. So since the goal of all the previous ages had arrived, how would you make the events of the first century typological of a yet future greater, for instance, great tribulation or a greater resurrection?
Because what all of those things pointed to, the goal of them all, was the risen God-man, Jesus, who died on our behalf and as the first fruits of the resurrection that we too will partake.
I don't believe that answered the question, Chris. What is your proof? How would you go about proving that the Great Tribulation, which you agree was in the first century, is typological or a foreshadowing of a yet future greater Great Tribulation?
In exactly the way that I detailed in my opening argument, which is by first concluding from the much simpler, easier to understand texts about the nature of resurrection that our future resurrection is individual and physical, and then reconciling the time texts in light of those. That would be my proof. In the same exact way that the alleged proof of a first century non-physical resurrection is based on all of those time texts. Each of us is simply reading one body of texts through our understanding of the other.
Actually, I'm assimilating both, because let's go back to Isaiah chapter 26.
You are assimilating both, but that's assimilating them with a historically unprecedented understanding of the nature texts. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, this is a hypothetical question. Why does a person believe that history has to be absolutely correct? We are told in Matthew chapter 24 that the great apostasy was going to happen in the first century.
Yeah, you sound a lot like Joseph Smith. That's right.
No, I'm basing it on what Jesus said. The love of the majority will grow cold. Now, that's not Joseph Smith or anyone else. That's what Jesus said. But to continue.
Right, sure, yeah. The difference is that Joseph Smith, like you, is saying this almost 2,000 years after Jesus said those words. The fact remains that a great apostasy can indeed happen in the first century, and then the gospel can go out to the ends of the earth, and throughout this period of time, the Holy Spirit is gifting teachers to the church with the ability to guide them and teach them. And your proposal is that the apostasy was just as great as Joseph Smith said it was, so much so that for 1,800 years, the entire church could get this very fundamental basics, according to what the author of Hebrews says, absolutely wrong.
Well, you're taking up a good bit of my time to preach, but, let's go back to Daniel chapter 12. One angel asked another when all of those things that had been predicted. Now, what was predicted? Great tribulation, resurrection, end of the age, shining forth of the righteous in the kingdom. The other angel responded and swore by the one who lives forever that when the power of the holy people was completely shattered, all of these things. Now, the antecedent to all these things is great tribulation, resurrection, end of the age. So what is your justification for saying, well, a typological foreshadowing of those things happened, but we're still waiting for the real stuff?
Well, firstly, I didn't say that a typological foreshadowing happened. I simply said that that's one of what may be multiple ways of reconciling the texts that you think are challenging my position. But to answer your question more directly, I point to the exact same, the counterpart to that statement in Daniel, which is in Revelation, where John is told, don't seal up the vision because the time is near for all these things to take place. And yet, in that very vision, John sees a very long period of time transpire that you collapse into 37 years, but any person that is actually reading it with any kind of connection to the way the Bible uses a large round number like 1,000 knows, that's like a way of saying a whole ton, a whole lot. There's just no precedent for collapsing 1,000 into 37, but there's an awful lot of biblical precedents for inflating 1,000 to far more than that. So like I said in my rebuttal, if you were to ask, if I were to tell you about a prophetic dream I think I had in which a whole bunch of stuff happened, and then there was a huge long period of time at the end of which something else would happen, and then I told you I think this is going to happen within our lifetime, you would immediately know that that I'm including the fact that that long period of time will begin in that time frame. That wouldn't mean that the end of that long time frame would happen very soon as well.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Is it true that the judgment of all men occurs at the end of the millennium?
The final judgment, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Jesus said, and let me formulate an argument and get your response to it. The judgment of all men is at the end of the millennium. Jesus said, behold, I come quickly, and the reward is with me to judge or to reward every man according to his works. Therefore, the end of the millennium was near when Revelation was written. Please show me the fallacy of that argument.
Would you mind repeating it for me, please?
Okay. The judgment of all men, the rewarding of all men would be at the end of the millennium, which you just acknowledged. Mm-hmm. Jesus said, behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me to give to every man according to his works. Behold, I come quickly. Therefore, the end of the millennium for the judgment rewarding of all men at the end of the millennium was near when John wrote.
In what verse did Jesus say that?
Revelation 22:12.
Yeah. So the way that I would understand that is by saying that the process of gathering the elect from the four winds is something which culminates in their being rewarded according to their works at the final judgment, is indeed something that began in the first century. But I don't see any reason for thinking that what he's saying is that everything that happens here, including the ultimate rewarding of people according to their works, would happen in that first century. In other words, and here's the other thing, I think that one of the things that I think hyper-preterists do is they assume that if the New Testament talks about the coming of Jesus in one place, then anytime it talks about him coming, it's got to be referenced to the exact same event. But that's something that I dispute precisely because I'm a preterist, because I see in the Old Testament God frequently referring to coming in judgment multiple times. So the day of the Lord, the coming of the Lord, this is gnomic language. This is the kind of language that can happen multiple times throughout history. So yeah, I do think that Jesus came soon in the sense that he rewarded first century apostate Jerusalem according to their works by destroying the city. But then and so the beast representing that apostate Jerusalem is thrown into the lake of fire. And then 1,000 years later in the vision, the resurrection happens, and I don't see any problem with coming to that conclusion. And again, I just want to reiterate that what is happening is bearing out exactly what I said in my opening statement. You are going to understand the texts about the nature of resurrection through the lens of your conclusions concerning these different time texts all pieced together. But I'm doing it the other way around.
Obviously, that's true. But the time statements are so clear, so emphatic, that they reject your concept of physical resurrection. You can't have physical resurrection. So to go back to the point that you tried to make there in Revelation chapter 22, verse 12, all of a sudden you're saying, well, this is a different coming to judge all men from the resurrection to judge all men in Revelation chapter 20. So the question is, where's the dichotomy? Where is the division? What's your justification for saying, oh, these are two different events to judge all men?
Well, number one, you've just contradicted yourself, because your argument earlier was that in the very next verses, the language of dogs being outside of the gates is future. But this is Jesus speaking in John's present. We're right now at the end of Revelation in the epilogue to his vision, not the vision itself. So you've contradicted, and rightly so, your previous statement that Revelation depicts unbelievers outside of the gates continuing to sin. It just doesn't, because what we're reading is in the epilogue. But more importantly, and directly to answering your question, the reason why Jesus could come quickly in one sense to judge first century apostate Jerusalem, but can also come again after the millennium to judge to repay everybody according to their works is because this kind of prophetic language can indeed have dual fulfillments. And the fact is that the first century was a judgment upon first century Jerusalem, and the resurrection of the dead will include a judgment upon all mankind.
And yet you're extrapolating. Now let me get another question or two in here.
Of course.
Do you agree that the destruction of Satan occurs at the end of the millennium?
Yeah.
Okay. Paul said in Romans chapter 16 and verse 20, the God of peace shall crush Satan under your feet shortly. Virtually every commentator that I'm aware of says that is a reference back to the proto-evangelium in Genesis chapter 3, the ultimate defeat of Satan at Christ's second coming. So Paul said that coming of Christ, the destruction of Satan, was coming very soon. It was coming shortly. Greek term entakai, which never means rapidly as opposed to soon. So Romans chapter 16, verse 20, has the destruction of Satan happening very soon. It's not ambiguous. It's not elastic and plastic. Revelation chapter 20 posits the destruction of Satan at the end of the millennium. Now, if you're going to say one is typological, then how is Satan destroyed twice? Was there a minor destruction in the first century and we're waiting for the real thing?
Yeah, absolutely. He was imprisoned in the first century. So where the John says in Revelation that he is chained for 1,000 years precisely so that he can no longer deceive the Goyim. And the nations. And what happened when, with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the Jewish apostates were no longer able to stymie the spread of the gospel in the way that I think they were able to up until that point. So
okay. You deflected quite seriously. I wasn't talking about the binding of Satan, which occurred at the beginning. I'm talking about the destruction of Satan, which occurs at the end. Paul said it was at hand, coming soon. And
Paul said,
Revelation chapter 20, verse 10 and following posits the destruction, not the binding, at the end. Now, since we're talking about the same event, the crushing of Satan, one was at the end of the millennium, the other at hand, tell me why that doesn't refer to the imminent destruction of Satan at the end of the millennium.
Well, you're assuming that the kind of destruction, and I put that in quotes because that's not the language Paul uses in Romans 16:20, is the same as the destruction of Satan at the end of the eschaton, in my view. But what Paul says in Romans 16:20 is that the God of peace will soon crush, soon tribo, Satan under your feet. And that's not a word that you find with regard to Satan in Revelation. So I have no problem with the notion that there is one sense in which he's crushed in Romans 16:20 in the first century. And then there's a more ultimate sense in which he's finally destroyed, which finalizes and ultimatizes, if that's a word, the temporary binding of him that this is in reference to. And again, that's just one way of other possible ways of reconciling these together. And I'm going to go with the clear language about the nature of resurrection being physical, and then interpret these texts in that lens.
Well, the language is not nearly as clear. But so what you're arguing here, correct me if I'm wrong, because Paul uses centribo in Romans chapter 16, and it's not used in Revelation, that they must be two different events. That was your argument.
No, that wasn't my argument. I didn't argue that is therefore how you should read it. You asked me how I can justify seeing that as something that would happen soon, but the destruction of Satan happening in the future. And I just gave you one way to do that.
And you argued that because Paul used centribo and it wasn't found in Revelation, that they're different.
No, what I argued is that because that's a different word, you can't assume, as I think you did, that they're referring to the same event.
If both are the crushing and the concept. Now, a while ago, all throughout your presentation, actually, you appealed to the consensus of scholarship. Well, the consensus scholarship is that Paul in Romans chapter 16 is going back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and that is Revelation chapter 20. So you're the one going against church history at this particular point. So what's your justification for it?
Show me where you said that I appealed to the consensus of scholarship. No, I didn't. I never once used a reference to commentators or scholars. What I referred to was the creedal affirmations, both at the very beginning of church history and in the Reformation era. And not all of the people that signed on to these were the kinds of scholars that you're referring to. So now you may think I'm picking at nits or splitting hairs. Fine. But the point is, my argument is about what the church from all around the known world, from every variation of Christianity, from Eastern Orthodox to Roman Catholic to Protestant and beyond, background, throughout church history is believed in what I'm affirming today. And the first person you can identify to teach your view was 150 years ago, roughly. Now, as for commentators, if you would like to go through every single commentary that you have or I have in my library to prove that every single one of them says that the crushing of Satan under his feet happening soon is a reference to the final destruction of Satan at the end of the millennium, sure, let's do it.
Don, you can have
one more.
more.
Use your time?
You can have one more question, Don.
Okay, in Isaiah chapter 27, the Lord said that Israel was slain by being sent off into captivity, but Israel would be, her sin would be taken away when the fortified city would be destroyed, when the altar would be turned to chalkstone, and the people whom the Lord had created would no longer find mercy. Now, Romans chapter 11 draws directly on that particular passage. So here is Paul saying that Israel's sin would be taken away in fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 27. Isaiah 27 says the taking away of Israel's sin would be when the fortified city would be destroyed, when the altar would be turned to chalkstone, and when the people whom the Lord had created would be destroyed. So tell me why and how that's not AD 70.
Well, again, I struggle to follow the linking of all these various texts together in the way that you're doing, much like somebody putting a bunch of strings up on a chalkboard. But what I will say is that, gosh, I just lost my train of thought. It would complete. Hold on, I'm going to answer your question, because that was your last question that you were given the option to ask.
Yeah.
If Jesus is the embodiment of Israel, and if we Gentile believers have been grafted into Israel by virtue of our union with Christ, then it can perfectly make sense that there could be an immediate fulfillment of this language when the temple is destroyed, insofar as Jesus is now risen, the quintessential Israel has come back to life, and then every individual united to him will do likewise. I don't see a problem with that. I know you do.
Well, when the grammatical flow of the text is when.
I think your time was up to ask questions, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I just made a point. Sorry about that.
Chris, and to be fair, Don, you had the final word in the first round. Chris, if you'd like a quick final word right now, feel free to take it.
No, that's okay.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate you providing us all a very engaging 30 minutes of cross-exam. I think we covered a lot, and time flew by. This has been an excellent debate so far. And
would you grant me just 1 minute to step away?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
If you needed a short break for the closing statement. So I'll let the audience know then. We have 5 minutes each left for closing statements. And then we are going to move into audience questions. And I have a ton of audience questions. I've bumped all the super chats to the top. And so we're going to do our best to get through as many of those questions as we can. And I will remind everybody that we have another week full of events. So we've got a couple more for you after this one. Of course, this has been a much anticipated debate, and I don't think Chris and Don, what they've done is met everybody's expectations. This has been fantastic so far. So tomorrow we'll be back for another one of our 2-in-1 events. This one will be a science-related topic. Does the geologic column exist? So we'll have Doc and Dr. Dino engaging this question. Then we'll be opening it up to an open mic.
Who's answering? Who's affirming and denying in that debate?
This one will be, so does the geologic column exist as represented in the textbooks? Kent will be denying that.
Oh, okay. All right. So it's as represented in an evolutionary old Earth framework. Gotcha.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because obviously it exists. Anyway, Troy, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that's good. That's a good clarified question. So I appreciate it. And then we'll be back Saturday. So we'll have, did Paul and James teach different gospels? Debate on dispensational salvation, Charles Jennings and David Preston. And with that, we've got Don back.
I apologize. Some of the medication I took has got me a dry mouth.
No worries. That's quite all right. I appreciate the endurance from the both of you. So with that, we have closing statements, 5 minutes each. Good time to wrap up our thoughts and points and address anything that we feel may have been left hanging. So Chris, we'll give you the first 5 minutes for a closing statement. Whenever you're ready, let me know and I'll start your timer.
All right. Well, again, Donnie, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Preston, for participating in the debate. I think that what I predicted at the end of my debate is exactly what has happened. I presented a very simple and straightforward case that didn't require me to jump to this text and connect it over here to this one, and then come down here with topology over here, and then Hosea here, and Isaiah and Daniel, and then everything over here. All I had to do was point out five simple facts. Number one, the fact of the matter is that the church has historically and universally affirmed our debate thesis, and we don't see anything like Dr. Preston's view arising until the mid-1800s. And the way that my opponent responded to that is by saying, well, there was a Mormon-like apostasy that lasted some 1,800 years, and he and Max King and James Stewart Russell, just like Joseph Smith, are restoring this thing that so many people missed. If you want to believe that, go for it. But that is not something that I find particularly compelling. Number two, I argued that the Bible says that the saints united to Christ will be raised like he was. And I even got in cross-examination Dr. Preston to admit that every time the New Testament uses the language of rising and resurrection to refer to Christ, it's his physical body coming back to life and emerging from the tomb. So somehow, although that language is always used of Christ, of his physical resurrection, nevertheless, all the resurrection language about believers who are united to Christ and who therefore are supposed to get a resurrection like his get an entirely different kind of resurrection. I mean, this is lunacy. And then on top of that, thankfully, praise God, Dr. Preston has backed off of his idea that the resurrection body of Jesus was burned up when he was ascending to the sky, but he still believes that body's gone. Or at the very least was transformed and is no longer the flesh and bones body that Jesus called his resurrection body. So the reality is my argument from Christology that we will rise with a body like the one to whom we're united rose with has been entirely unanswered. When it comes to anthropology, this isn't something that we had an opportunity to discuss in cross-examination, but it also didn't come up in Dr. Preston's rebuttal. But the fact remains that the Bible consistently portrays embodied physical life as the good design for human nature. And when it speaks about people who are dead, it does so negatively as being unable. It's bad because they no longer participate in what goes on under the sun, which is exactly what Dr. Preston believes will be the case for everybody who's in Christ and dies now. So, and meanwhile, the Bible speaks glowingly of this restoration of the cosmos, which we also didn't get to discuss. Dr. Preston admitted that he believes that sin and evil and pain and disease and death will go on forever and ever and ever. People will forever and ever and ever and ever suffer from cancer, will suffer from gangrene, will suffer pain, will suffer injustices, will suffer from racism, will suffer from discrimination. Men will take away the bathrooms and changing rooms of women, and women will forever treat their husbands without the respect that they're due in marriage. There will forever be theft. There will forever be enslavement. Girls being sold on as sex slaves. That will happen forever. That is the picture that my opponent is saying you can expect for eternity on earth. Now, granted, we will get to escape that and then go on to be somewhere else forever, but forever people will continue to suffer from those things. Meanwhile, Scripture says that the creation was subjected to futility because of Adam and Eve's sin and will be restored when we are resurrected. That is not an argument of mine that went sufficiently answered. So then finally, when it comes to whether you should read the time texts through the lens of the resurrection text as I do, or the resurrection text through the language of time text as my opponent does, the fact remains his case has been exactly what I characterized it to be. Go here, 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 and then over here, and then over here, and this language has got to be referring to the exact same thing that this is, and it referred to it. If you want to do that, fine, but just remember that if you do so, you are exchanging the Christian faith for something that is unrecognizable, one in which Jesus's body ceases to live at the ascension, one in which sin and evil and death go on for eternity here on earth, one in which the Holy Spirit has utterly failed to guide his people on this topic for some 1,800 years until, like Joseph Smith, people like Max King and Don Preston and James Stewart Russell can revive what the Bible actually taught. And I don't think that's a cost worth paying. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Chris, for that 5-minute concluding statement. Don, whenever you're ready, you also have 5 minutes for a concluding statement, and the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Very good. Well, I want to take note of the fact that I gave a presentation in which I laid out exegetically all of these different passages. Now, once again, let me take note of the fact that Chris, as a Reformed guy, has literally scoffed at the idea of analogia scriptura. He says, well, Preston's on here and there and there and there and there and there. Well, the point of fact is, in every one of the passages that I adduced, what do we have? We have death, we have tribulation, we have resurrection, and we have the emphatic statements of all of it taking place at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. So what does Chris do? Well, he hypothesizes and says, well, one of the possible ways, and really all in the world he's doing is hoping that something will stick. He didn't answer any of the arguments that I made. He didn't go to a single text that spoke about, the death that came through violation of Torah, not being physical death. I pointed out that Chris agrees that the death of 1 Corinthians 15 to be overcome at the resurrection is the same death to be overcome from Hosea, but the death of Hosea was not physical death. He didn't touch it. He didn't try. He tried to say that Daniel chapter 12, well, maybe there was something in the first century, but yet it's still pointing forward. He didn't give us any proof whatsoever of it. He hypothesized and said, now it's certainly possible of some different possibilities that it may point forward to something in our future. But ladies and gentlemen, he never produced one single verse to suggest that what happened in the first century. As a matter of fact, I presented 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, in which Paul said the goal of all the previous ages had arrived in the first century. He didn't say it was going to stretch out and stretch out and stretch out, waiting for the real, genuine goal to come across. So I adduced all of these passages in which, once again, we have what? We have death, resurrection, the salvation of Israel at the time of the destruction of the corporate body of Israel. I also pointed out, let me remind you of this, okay, that Chris understands that the resurrection was a promise of Old Covenant Israel. I made a point 2 or 3 different times that when Chris admits that the promise of the resurrection is found from the Old Testament, but it's not yet fulfilled according to him, that means that Old Covenant Israel remains God's covenant people today. It means that God has 2 covenant people today. It means that God has 2 covenants today. And of course, Chris didn't even mention that argument. Third, I pointed out that Chris agrees that the resurrection is the time of the taking away of Israel's sin. Well, guess what? Daniel 9 is very emphatic. 70 weeks are determined to take away Israel's sin. The terminus of the 70 weeks, according to Chris Date himself, was in AD 70. So now all of a sudden, Chris has got to take the position, well, yeah, maybe there was some sort of in some way, somehow, taking away of Israel's sin in AD 70. He doesn't explain how. But we're really looking for a yet future coming of the Lord to take away Israel's sins. But that doesn't help because it still means that Israel, Old Covenant Israel, remains God's covenant people today. I pointed out, Paul said that the resurrection, not a resurrection, not some resurrection, but the consummate resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 would be when the law, that was the strength of sin, would be destroyed and taken out of the way. I shared with you that Chris Date has told me, I've got the answers to the questions right here. The law, that was the strength of sin, was the law of Moses. Now, Chris Date ridiculed the appeal to time statements. He said, well, they're just too difficult, and you can't view the resurrection through time statements. Well, that's a false hermeneutic. Who made that rule? But the point of fact is, Chris Date himself agrees that the resurrection would be when the law, that was the strength of the sin, would be removed. And Chris Date agrees the law, that was the strength of sin, was the law of Moses that ended in AD 70. And Chris, furthermore, never addressed the question, how could anybody convince anybody that the resurrection, as he envisions it, took place in the first century. I believe that's all of my time, so I'll just stop right there.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen, for those concluding statements. Again, excellent debate. I've been looking forward to this one. I know the audience has as well. And you both have certainly given us a debate to remember on the topic of full preterism and the resurrection of the dead. We've had a lot of engagement from our live chat. We've had an excellent live chat, roughly 300 people the whole time. And so we got a lot of questions to get through. Now, I don't like to be overly strict on how we answer these questions in terms of time limits, because obviously some questions are going to take a little longer to answer than others. So let's just, I guess, do our best to be cognizant of the fact that we got quite a few questions to get through, and pretty balanced too. I think we got a solid mix of questions for the two of you, as we've had a good diversity of views represented tonight in our chat. So let's start right at the beginning here with a question for Chris. And so this comes in from SWE. I appreciate your question. $5 super chat. Thank you to everybody for supporting tonight's debate. How does Chris deal with time-sensitive language like soon, near, and before some standing here will taste death when referring to Jesus' coming? Chris, go ahead.
Very easy. This is precisely why I'm a preterist of the historic and orthodox variety, not the hyper variety. Specifically, I believe that Jesus did, in fact, come in judgment in 70 AD upon apostate Jerusalem. He came before some that he was talking to tasted death. He came and judged apostate Jerusalem before this generation passed away, and on it goes. So, yeah, I think that the issue here is not how can a preterist like me explain the soon, near, and quickly language. I think the real question is, how can one justify insisting that there is only one sense, that only one event that could be called Jesus is coming, when the whole one big reason we're preterists is because the Old Testament refers to God coming in judgment on multiple occasions. Of course, Jesus can come multiple times in judgment, both in the first century, in the time frame that the questioner is asking about, as well as bodily in the return from heaven for the restoration of all things and the resurrection of the dead.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate it. Don, the floor is yours if you had anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, well, the trouble of it is that every single constituent element of the eschatological consummation, the final coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection, is posited in the language of imminence. Hebrews chapter 9, unto those who eagerly look for him, he shall appear again the second time apart from sin for salvation. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 37. Now, in a very, very little while, hoson mikron is the Greek, the one who is coming will come and will not tarry. Well, Chris has him tarrying 2,000 years, but that's the coming of the Lord for salvation. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5. Christ was ready, from the Greek word etoimos, which means not only morally prepared, but temporally imminent. Alfred's Greek Testament confirms that the Greek reader would have understood the imminent judge. So Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. Well, that's the resurrection. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7, the end of all things has drawn near. Well, guess what? The end would be at the end of the millennium, at the coming of the Lord and the resurrection, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 21 to 23. And 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, the appointed time, the kairos, the divinely appointed time for the judgment, not a judgment, not some judgment, for the judgment. Well, he uses what's known as the anaphoric article there, which refers right directly back to verse 5, which means, and Daniel Wallace confirms this, by the way, and is beyond the basics Greek grammar, the anaphoric article refers back to the previous use of judgment. That's verse 5. So here's Peter affirming that the time, the divinely appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead had arrived 2,000 years ago. Not a type, not a shadow, the appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead.
And I think, Donnie, you said that the person to whom the question is asked gets a final word. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, you get the last word, Chris.
Okay, so Don is just patently wrong. Not every constituent element is said to have happened in the language of imminence. One event, at least, is said to happen after 1,000 years, which biblically always refers to a much larger reality, and that is the resurrection. John said, for 1,000 years after, so the beast is thrown in, the beast who had deceived people, or the beast and the false prophet who had deceived people into taking the mark of the beast, that beast is thrown in at the beginning of the millennium, and then 1,000 years later, the resurrection happens and Satan is destroyed, etc. So yeah, I'm perfectly fine accepting that the vast majority of biblical prophecy was fulfilled by the time of the first century. That's why I'm what's known historically as a preterist. But there is something, at least one thing that the Bible says will happen very long after that, and that is the resurrection of the dead.
Thank you, Chris, for that last word. Okay, gentlemen, let's move on to the next question. Now we have one for you, Don. And so this comes in from 21st Century Mind, $50 super chat. I really appreciate the support for tonight's debate, and of course the time that our guests have given to us. So, okay, this one's for you, Don. You disagree? Yeah,
I'm trying to read the question here.
I can read it out loud for everybody. No worries.
Yeah. Okay. I think I have the gist of the question. Okay. I certainly do categorically disagree with Tim LaHaye's left behind rapture. I think, I think Chris would disagree with that idea because he's certainly not a dispensationalist. So the question continues: if full preterism made a film on what and how the saints experienced 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4, what experience would the film show when they metaphorically met Christ at his return in 70 AD? Well, that's a broad subject. My book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, goes into it in depth. But let me just simply say that one particular aspect of it is the concept of shame versus honor, or shame versus glory. This is pointed out in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 42 to 44. It, that is the natural man, is sown in dishonor or shame. It is raised in honor. There was a concept in the ancient world, very, very common, verified by a host of scholars. Any group that left one group to join another, especially a group that was the focus of persecution, they were the object of shame. They were the object of persecution very often, as the early church was. When that group, the persecuted group, was vindicated, they received honor and glory. This is specifically pointed out 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. The nascent church at Thessalonica was persecuted by the Jewish synagogue. They were the objects of shame. But Paul promised that at the parousia of Christ, who is going to come to be glorified, and his saints, they likewise would receive glory and honor, according, again, and that's Colossians chapter 2 as well. And so they had a very experiential understanding and knowledge that with the destruction of the persecuting power of Judaism in the destruction of Jerusalem, they now stood identified and vindicated as the sons of God.
Okay, thank you, Don. Chris, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
I don't think I've really got anything to say here. I mean, this is such a specific question about how hyper-preterists would depict the events of AD 70 in light of these texts. And as I'm not a hyper-preterist, I'm not really sure what I have to add there. I think the only thing I'll add is that one of the things that does not make sense to me, and maybe it does to hyper-preterists like Don, but one of the things that doesn't make sense to me is that the resurrection of the dead is spoken of as an event at which all humankind participates. But if the resurrection is something that happened in the 70 AD, then that is not an event at all. It's the start of a period of time during which, I mean, something happens, some kind of resurrection happens in the first century, and then when we die and we go to heaven, we're not. I just don't even understand the idea of the resurrection as a cosmic event, as depicted in Revelation and elsewhere, Isaiah 25, seems to demand that every human being experiences that at roughly the same time, something that my opponent's view does not appear to entail. So, but anyway, that's all I've got to say.
No, you don't understand. I'm not trying to be smart. I'm not trying to be caustic at all. But no, you clearly don't understand what we're teaching. So, next question.
Okay, gentlemen, appreciate it. Now we got one for you, Chris. So this comes in from Michael, $10 super chat. Chris, can you provide an example of dual fulfillment in the Bible?
Sure. I'll provide two. One is the text in Isaiah in which God promises that the maiden will give birth to a son. Scholars, if I'm not mistaken, tend to agree that that was a reference not to the virgin birth of Jesus immediately, but to the birth of a ruler in history prior to the time of Christ. And then you see the ultimate fulfillment in the actual virgin birth of Christ in the first century. One other example I'll offer is the language of used to condemn the king of Tyre, if I remember correctly, language that is often thought to discuss Satan and his ultimate fate. So you've got this language, I want to say it's in Ezekiel, I don't remember off the top of my head, but you've got this language of the morning star falling from heaven, and it was once beautiful in the garden and so forth. And scholars, I think, agree that that has a primary reference in the king of Tyre, then an ultimate fulfillment in Satan. My understanding is it's not controversial at all, except amongst hyperpreterists, that the Bible is replete with examples of dual fulfillment.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Don, over to you if you had anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, it raises some very, very serious questions. Just like Gary DeMar and even Kenneth Gentry, I don't like the term dual fulfillment. I prefer type and antitype, or shadow versus reality. And once you start positing that, well, okay, you've got dual fulfillment. What about triple fulfillment? What about quadruple fulfillment? Why not? I mean, who's to set the boundaries? The dual fulfillment argument was really generated in order to avoid the first century fulfillment. And by the way, what we find in type and antitype is Old Covenant Israel was the type. Her events were typological that were being fulfilled in the first century, not centuries beyond that, but in the first century concerning Old Covenant Israel. And let's not forget that Jesus, speaking of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, was very emphatic. These be the days of vengeance in which all things written must be fulfilled. Now, somebody can say, well, that was just during vengeance. Well, that's okay. Somebody says that's just all things concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. That's fine too, because every constituent element of eschatology predicted in the Old Testament is inextricably bound up with the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, not at some mythical, imaginary end of time, the destruction of Jerusalem. That you can't get beyond the first century in type and antitype.
Thank you, Don. Chris, you get the last word. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually really easy to affirm the last thing that Don said there and still be an Orthodox Christian. You can say that the resurrection began with the resurrection of Christ, which happened in the first century. Remember what even Don admitted? All the New Testament language about the resurrection of Christ referred to his physical body coming back to life. That happened in the first century, beginning with Jesus. The resurrection, Jesus was the first fruits of it. And it finds its ultimate fulfillment, according to John, 1,000 or more years after the first century. So, yeah, I don't have a problem affirming that all the prophecies that were written are intimately linked to what happens in 70 AD. The resurrection began in the first century with the resurrection of Jesus, and it will complete with the resurrection of his people.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Now we got one for you, Don. 21st Century Mind, $50 super chat. Appreciate the support. His question is this: if the saints already had the Spirit of Christ ontologically living inside, describe how the saints tapped into the spiritual realm, like Elijah's servant, to ontologically escort the Spirit of Christ back to the biosphere at Christ's royal visit. What are your thoughts?
There's a question for you.
Yeah. he's giving me some work tonight with these questions.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the first century saints had the miraculous gift of the Holy Spirit dwelling in them. And it was that miraculous gift of the Holy Spirit that was to bring about the resurrection. That's what was promised in Ezekiel chapter 37. And by the way, that Holy Spirit was to resurrect Israel corporately, not individual bodies out of the dirt, but Israel corporately out of alienation. They were alienated from God. That was death. They were to be reconciled to God. That reconciliation was resurrection. That's the simplest explanation of it. So the first century saints had the Spirit of Christ. They were miraculously endowed with the miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit. And the language of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is based upon the two Greek words, parousia and apontesis. And apontesis does not mean to escort Christ back to heaven. It meant the spiritual realm of Christ, just like Revelation chapter 21, verse 1 and 2. I saw a new Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven. That is at the parousia. And the voice said, the tabernacle of God is with man. It is not man leaving the earth. It is Christ coming to dwell with us. And that occurred at the end of the millennium.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate it. Chris, the floor is yours if there's anything you'd like to add.
I don't even understand the question. So I will just observe that historically Christians have agreed that the Spirit is a guarantee, that we have the Spirit as a guarantee of our future bodily resurrection. Somebody's welcome to come along 1800 years after the church is founded and, like Joseph Smith, say there was a great apostasy, and we are the ones who are resurrecting, excuse the pun, the view that Christians have universally neglected for almost 2,000 years. But that's not something I'm prepared to do. When Paul talks about the Spirit in our hearts as a guarantee, it's a guarantee that we will one day come back to life even after we die.
Thank you, Chris. Don, if you'd like a last word, feel free to go ahead.
Well, Chris criticizes the idea of the concept of a great apostasy, and yet Jesus is more than emphatic about it in Matthew chapter 24, 10 to 12, verse 12 especially, the love of the majority of the people. It is hol poiloi. It is not simply the love of many, it is the many. And as the New American Standard Version renders it, the love of the majority would grow cold. So Chris can ridicule and say, well, Don's nothing but another form of Mormons, claiming an apostasy. No, I'm not the one that claimed the apostasy. And let's not forget 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul said that the great apostasy had to happen before the day of the Lord and before the resurrection. But Jesus said that great apostasy of the majority would occur in the first century. Now, it's up to Chris whether or not he accepts that or whether he rejects it, but the words are right there in the text. As to the earnest of the Spirit, which is exactly what the miraculous was, that was limited to the first century. The miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit were poured out on the day of Pentecost. They lasted for 40 years. They are not available today. Chris is not a prophet. I mean, no slander whatsoever, but Chris is not a prophet of the Lord inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so that very special last days period was to be the time of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. That was the time to prepare the church to bring Christ to dwell with man once again.
Okay, thank you for the last word, Don. We're moving on smoothly here. Zachary, $10 super chat. We got a question for you now, Chris. Chris, would you please address this philosophical issue with a physical resurrection concept? Every single cell, membrane, and nutrient in my body used to be a component of hundreds of other bodies.
Yeah, so this is a great question, but I think it it has a fatal flaw, which is that the exact same question can be applied to my body now compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago. The fact remains that over time, all of our cells are replaced with the possible exception of neurons, but we are more than just our brains. Our body is more than just our brains. So there is something about our body now that makes it the same body it was when I was born 44 years ago, that is not violated by the fact that virtually every cell in my body now is a different cell than it existed when I was born. So what could that be? Well, God is the creator, and I am convinced that identity like this is wrapped up in God's telos for us, his design for us. if you a very imperfect analogy would be the relationship between, say, J.R.R. Tolkien and Middle Earth. If by conceiving of the story of Middle Earth actually came into existence, people would die and come and go throughout that, but what secures their identity as the entities in the world of the story is that is God's, well, in this case, J.R.R. Tolkien's knowledge of them as that person. And so in the same way, I have no problem with conceiving of the notion that God has has an understanding of what Chris's body is, the form, not the matter, but the form of the body, and he can recreate that form thousands of years after my death if he so chooses. And this is something that Christians, Orthodox Christians anyway, for 2,000 years have had no problem with, because they've universally agreed that when Paul says the body that goes into the ground is the body that comes out of it, they had no problem with affirming that that's the self-same body, to use the language of the Reformed confessions. So, I just appeal to God being God to answer this question. And I don't see a problem with it, given that I know without doubt that the body I have now is the same body that I had when I was born.
Thank you, Chris. Don, over to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I believe that's really quite insufficient for an answer. It's easy to say, well, God is God. God can do anything. Well, God cannot create a round square. There's some things that God cannot do. And when you consider the vast number of human beings that have lived and died, decomposed and gone into the dust, and this is the point of the question, it would be mathematically impossible for, let's just postulate here and say that the Lord is going to come in 1,000,000 years from now. That means that 1,000,000 years from now, every human being who has died, decomposed, and gone into the dust or into the sea has become a part and parcel of every single human being that will live between now and 1,000,000 years off. There are only so many molecules, so many atoms in the universe. Now, I don't know what the number is, but to suggest that God will separate every single one, and let's say that somebody living 10,000 years from now has some atoms of my feet, and another person living 4,000 years from now has some molecules of my eyes, and atoms, what have you, and God's going to pick and choose out of all of that. It really becomes quite philosophically untenable. It doesn't even make good nonsense insofar as I am concerned. I just don't see that giving an easy answer of, well, God is God. That's insufficient. God is a God of logic. And to suggest something like that goes beyond the scope of logic, I think it's really quite insufficient. And one more thing, let's keep in mind something I brought up in the body of the debate. Paul said the natural body, the natural body, is sown. That goes into the grave. The natural body, comes out a spiritual body. And I suggested then, I say now, and this is directly related to Chris's answer, that's not talking about biology. It's not talking about regathering of atoms. It's talking about the moral character of a person, and the natural man, the reprobate man that goes into the grave, cannot come out a spiritual man unless Chris is willing to say that the Holy Spirit is going to convert that person in the grave. He doesn't believe that. This is a humongous problem for Chris, and that's why he didn't address it.
Chris, you get the last word? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a spiritual body, Paul says, comes out of the ground, not a spiritual man. Paul has just referred to spiritual men and natural men earlier in his letter in the here and now. Now in 1 Corinthians 15, he refers to the natural body going into the ground and coming out a spiritual body, not meaning non-material, as some hyperpreterists argue, but thankfully it appears as though Don does not, but rather a body that is now caught up with the spiritual nature that we have as spiritual men. In other words, what is true of us judicially, positionally, with respect to God, will also be true of our bodies. Right now, we can overcome the natural desires of our natural body for sex and for gluttonous food eating eating and so forth, we can overcome that because we are spiritual men. Our risen spiritual body will be driven by likewise spiritual inclinations, not physical ones, natural ones. So there just is no argument there that Don has. Now, as for the claim, he did a great job of ridiculing my answer, and that's because he misrepresented it. This is what's called erecting a straw man and burning it down. I explicitly said it's not the same matter that makes my body now the body that it was 44 years ago. I explicitly said it's the form of the matter, not the matter itself, that makes my body now the same body as it was some 44 years ago. And in like manner, God who created matter in the first place can certainly create brand new matter that has never been a part of anybody else's body and construct it in the same form of my body as it is now, and that will be the same body that went into the ground, just as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So the way that Don has to rebut my answer is by, number one, misrepresenting what I answer into a caricature of what it actually was, and number two, ignoring half of my answer, because my answer wasn't only God is God, it was also this body is the same body as it was 44 years ago. You know how I know? Because I've been in it the whole time.
All right, appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you for the answers to that question. Now we've got a couple for the both of you. What we'll do is, Chris, you just had the last word on the previous question. So to keep things balanced as we're doing, we'll have you start with this one, and then Don, you can go second, and then we'll move on.
Oh, because it's for both of us, not just one of us. Gotcha.
Right,
okay.
It'll just be one response each.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. So I found it strange that throughout this debate, Dr. Preston has referred to the closing verses of Revelation as if it's part of the imagery, and then he contradicted that by pointing out that Jesus, when he talks about people, he's appealing to people to come. That's in John's present. The reason I bring this up is because what unites preterists is the recognition that the nature of the vision that John sees, that he records in Revelation, is that it's symbolic. So this isn't when I use the tree of life as an argument, I'm not arguing that in the eschaton there will literally be a tree of life, which is literally for the healing of the nations, which literally is beside a river and from which we literally partake in order to continue eating. That's possible, but there's no basis for concluding that given the nature of the vision recorded in Revelation. What it does mean, though, is that the purpose and nature of the tree of life as it originally appeared in the garden, which is explicitly so that had they continued to have access to it, Adam and Eve would have been able to live forever. And by revoking that access, God guarantees Adam and Eve's eventual demise. And I hope somebody asks me about on the day of on the day that you eat of the fruit, you shall surely die, because Don gets that totally wrong. But anyway, the tree of life would have secured Adam and Eve's ongoing life. By revoking their access to it, it guarantees their demise. So what does its reappearance in the symbolism of Revelation after the 1,000 years symbolize? The fact that immortality, which could have been had if Adam and Eve had continued to eat from the tree, will now be available to Christ's risen saints. You don't have to press it into hyperliteralism the way that unfortunately some futurists do, and unfortunately some hyperpreterists seem to do when it comes to the end of Revelation, which isn't part of the vision anyway.
Thank you, Chris. Don, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
To suggest that the vision of the new heaven and new earth is not part of the vision, is that what you're arguing, Chris?
No.
Okay. All right. So the new heaven and new earth, the New Jerusalem, is in fact a part of the vision. And in the vision, what do we find? People outside the city. Well, Chris says we can't press the literalism. Well, I agree that you can't press it ultimately literally, but outside is still outside, and coming in is still coming in, and eating of the tree of life for healing represents something. Now, if it doesn't represent healing, then what is it? Furthermore, Revelation chapter 21 and 22 are based upon Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66. Isaiah 65 emphatically teaches death in the new creation. An infant that dies 100 years old shall be counted accursed. A sinner that dies. Now, in his debate with Michael Miano, Chris said, well, in the Septuagint, it posits a hypothetical, if there is a sin. No, it doesn't. I've looked at all three translations of the Septuagint, Brenton's, Moises, and I've forgotten the fellow Thompson's translation. Not one of them gives a hypothetical, as Chris in his debate with Michael Biano suggested. And Chris, I've got the note if you would like it. So yes, you did do that. So nonetheless, here in Isaiah 65, you have death. By the way, you have labor and everything else associated with it. Not only that, in Isaiah chapter 66, after the day of the Lord in flaming fire, after the creation of the new heaven and new earth, you have the survivors of that day going to the nations who had never known the Lord and bringing them to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. So what we have in Isaiah and the prophetic background and source of Revelation 21 and 22, you do in fact have death. You still have sin because you got sinners dying, and you've got evangelism. So unless there's a contrast between 65, 66, Isaiah, and Revelation 21 and 22, then Chris's objections just simply go up in smoke. There's no validity to them. There's no probative value to them whatsoever.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you for the responses from the both of you. It was a question for both. And so let's move on now here to a question just for you, Don. Another one from 21st Century Mind. Must be one of your biggest fans, Don. $50 super chat. I appreciate it. I'll read through it here just so he gets the most out of his gift. And so the question for you, Don, is this. Jesus told the saints to leave their possessions and flee to the mountains of Judea. Did Christ leave them stranded, and did they eventually return to their destroyed homes to later preach the gospel to the Roman soldiers who murdered their unsaved families? What are your thoughts on that one, Don?
Good question. First of all, Jesus obviously did tell them, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then flee from Judea. We know that they went over to the east of Jordan. And as a matter of fact, there are some historical sources that do say that after the destruction of Jerusalem, after it was over, they did return back to the city of Jerusalem, and they set up camps, encampments all throughout Jerusalem. Pardon me, all that was left of Jerusalem. And guess what? They did evangelize. And so the question seems to overlook these historical references that we do find.
Thank you, Don. Chris, the floor is yours. Go ahead if you had anything to add.
I don't think I do. I think on this one point, Don and I are in agreement.
Okay, there we go. Nice to get some agreement in these passionate debates. So let's move along. You guys are doing great in the Q&A. I really appreciate it. So, okay, I guess we'll go a question for the both of you now. So what we'll do is we'll start with you, Don, and then this way Chris gets the last word for this one. So this comes in from Crazy Ivan, $10 super chat. Chris/Don. So question for the both of you. Chris compared how Don tied together various passages from all over scripture with Chris's more localized approach. Isn't that hermeneutic backward for arriving at a proper understanding?
I'm first.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it is backwards. It violates analogia scriptura, which says you take the testimony from here, you take the testimony from here, and you take the testimony from here, or whatever, and you conflate all of that, and you come up with a holistic approach. But Chris wants to take, for instance, passages like 1 Corinthians 15 with an atomistic approach, even though he admits that Paul's drawing from Isaiah 25, Hosea chapter 13. But I've already shown that Hosea 13 wasn't talking about biological death. I've already shown that Isaiah chapter 25 posited that resurrection and the salvation of Israel, which is the time of the resurrection, at the time of the destruction of the city and the temple, when they were turned over to foreigners. So I believe that Chris's hermeneutic here is fundamentally flawed. And for him to ridicule my approach of taking an entire body of scripture, all of which I demonstrated very clearly, they all speak of death, they all speak of resurrection, they all speak of the destruction of Jerusalem, and they all speak of the salvation of Israel at that very time. And yet Chris really said he just categorically rejects that because I'm just drawing from here and there and everywhere. So yes, I reject Chris's hermeneutical approach.
Thank you, Don. Chris, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, yeah, it's true. He does reject what he has characterized as my approach, but he has once again erected a straw man. Contrary to his claim otherwise, I do believe in analogia scriptura. I do believe in tota scriptura, but I also believe in the doctrine of, I mean, the analogia fide is that clear texts illuminate the meaning of unclear texts. And what I demonstrated was very clearly that the nature of humankind as God designed it, as very good creation, is to be physically embodied and breathing. I demonstrated that the Bible does promise a restoration of all things that includes the purging of sin and death and evil and sickness and so forth, all of which Dr. Preston believes will go on for eternity here. I demonstrated, even by Don's own admission, that everywhere the New Testament says that Jesus rose and was resurrected, it's about his physical body coming back to life. And the Bible says that we will rise with a resurrection like his, but he denies that whenever the word resurrection or rising refers to us, that it's about our physical bodies coming back to life. See, my case was very simple. I was using very simple texts and the very simple reality of church tradition. And just as a side note, this whole me and my Bible under a tree thing is not the doctrine of sola scriptura. The doctrine of sola scriptura has always been that scripture is the sole infallible authority, not that it's the sole authority, full stop. Even the reformers themselves appealed to the writings of the fathers, as I have done. So all throughout church history until James Stewart Russell, Christians believe in a physical resurrection from the dead in our future. And along comes Russell King and Don Preston, not to mention William Bell and Michael Miano. And like Joseph Smith, they're correcting the great apostasy after 1800 years. I don't think that that argument pieced together at like putting all these different lines together on a corkboard, that is not a clear case that should determine that should prompt us to forego 1800 plus years of church tradition and radically change our faith to something unrecognizable that includes sin and death and evil going on forever, Jesus's body disappearing on his way up to heaven, and on it goes. I don't think that incredibly difficultly pieced together case with its disastrous implications into various other areas of the faith warrants subjecting the clear and simple and straightforward case that I presented to that dog's breakfast that my opponent presented. So yes, tota scriptura, analogia scriptura, but also analogia fide. Interpret the clear, interpret the unclear in light of the clear. All these timing statements that require I go here, this typology, that language, this language has got to be the same here as it is there. It must be referring to the same thing. All of that is very tortuous. The case I presented is very simple. So I just simply interpret the unclear in light of the clear.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Gentlemen, appreciate your responses on that one. It was a question for the both of you. You both got a response. So let's move on here now to a question for you, Don. And so this comes in from SWE, $5 super chat. Much appreciated. Question is this: how does full preterism reconcile 1 Corinthians 15 verses 51 to 54's physical resurrection with its spiritual interpretation by AD 70, given Paul's literal wording? Go ahead.
Well, first of all, it is being taken for granted that Paul is talking literally of physical bodies. The context of 1 Corinthians 15 is presented to us from the book of Hosea. Paul uses an inclusio. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 to 4, he cites Hosea chapter 6, on the third day he shall raise us up. He closes with Hosea chapter 13 and verse 14. That tells us that everything in Paul's discussion is taken from Hosea. So back to an argument that I've made repeatedly that Chris hasn't touched, not even hinted at it, is that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, 51 to 54, for instance, is the resurrection of of Hosea chapter 13. The resurrection of Hosea chapter 13 would be from covenantal death, alienation from God, sin death. So if we're going to allow Paul to use Hosea as he says he is using it, then unless Chris is able to prove that Paul is radically changing the nature and the identity of the death, and therefore the nature and the identity of the resurrection, then his doctrine of individual bodily resurrection just simply goes out the window. Secondly, Paul said, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep. He's talking to first century living, breathing human beings and says not all of them were going to die. Just like Matthew 16, 27, 28, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's 1 Corinthians 15. Not all of us shall sleep. And on. Back to Chris's admission. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15:54 would be when the law that was the strength of sin would be destroyed. The law that was the strength of sin was the law of Moses. Chris Dates says, therefore, the resurrection would be at the end of the law of Moses, which Chris Dates says was in AD 70, and he hasn't touched that.
Okay, thank you, Don. Chris, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Don is referring to is something that he characterized as what I said to him in the answers and applied it to 1 Corinthians 15. But I've never, what he's claiming is an admission of mine has not been any such thing. And he chose not to press me on it. And he can hold up a sheet with questions on it, just like I can repeatedly put up this meme that illustrates the nature of his case. The reality is I did not say that that death was defeated in the first century. That isn't what I said. What verse 56 of 1 Corinthians says is that the sting of death is sin and the power of sin is in the law. It doesn't say that the law, sin, and death are all defeated in the first century. What we do have, however, is the fact that Paul is quoting from a variant translation of the Septuagint, Isaiah 25, in which God promises to swallow up death forever. And it's not just for Israel. It's for all peoples, all nations. And this is the language that Revelation uses after 1,000 years, not 37, 1,000 years. You know, God doesn't own the cattle on the 1,000 hills, but then the 1,001st hill, those cattle belong to Joe Farmer down the street. The cattle on 1,000 hills, the fact that God owns that means that he owns all the many more cows than that. And the 1,000 years of Revelation cannot be compressed into 37 years as my opponent wants to. So the fact that Revelation, using this language at the end of the 1,000 years, 1,000 years after the beast is thrown in, because he had persuaded people to take the mark of the beast, at the end of those 1,000 years, a great period of time, is when the stuff that Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians 15 takes place. It's when Yahweh will swallow up the covering that's over all peoples, not just Jews.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Don, you get the last word. Go ahead.
Yeah, Chris says it's impossible for large numbers to be compressed into small numbers. That's simply false. When David killed Goliath, what was the song that was sung by the women of Israel? Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain his 10,000s. He's killed one person. And so, well, it can't be just 10,000. It's got to be 10. It can be all that more. No, it's one person. The Hebrews very commonly used large numbers to emphasize the greatness of something, not the numeric value. They very often use small numbers to emphasize the greatness of a value or of a victory over large numbers. And so Chris is simply pressing pretty much of a rigid literalism, even though he would deny that rigid literalism, because he's saying, well, no, it could be a whole lot more than 1,000. Well, it's been 2,000 so far. And so how long is Chris willing to extrapolate that? And so notice, once again, he has completely and totally ignored the language of Isaiah 25, which I cited. It was on the chart, would be when the city, the fortified city, would be destroyed, when the temple was turned over to foreigners. That would be the time of the Messianic banquet. I pointed out, Messianic banquet would be when the sons of the kingdom are cast out. He never touched it. It would be in the day of Israel's salvation. Israel's salvation would be when the city and the temple was turned over. I did the same with Isaiah 27. I did the same thing with Isaiah 26. And he says, well, all Preston is doing is just grabbing here and there and everywhere. Well, I'm showing the consistent, harmonious pattern, because as I pointed out, which he has not denied, and he can't deny it because it's there, every single one of those texts talk about death. They talk about resurrection. They talk about the great tribulation. Now, since Chris applies the Great Tribulation to the first century, he's going to have to resort once again to there's another Great Tribulation in order to get the real resurrection coming. There's not a word of support for that in any of those texts.
Okay, thank you, Don, for that last word. Gentlemen, we're over time, but we have a few super chats left. And so my recommendation, let's do some power rounds. Maybe just a minute each.
Lightning round.
Yeah,
well,
lightning round.
Listen, I apologize. I have to take a step away. Again, I'm an old man. You have to excuse me. I'll be right back.
Okay. No problem, Don. Thank you. Okay, so I'll let the audience know, yes, we've had just a ton of questions come in. We could probably be answering questions if we answered every question until same time tomorrow. I want to respect the time that our guests, our debaters, Chris and also Don, have given to us. I got to say, a few hours have flown by. I've learned a lot, Chris, from you and Don. It's been an excellent debate. It's an important topic, and clearly there are a lot of people very much interested in it, as we've had a fantastic audience with just a ton of engagement, a lot of passion in the chat, a lively live chat, nothing wrong with that. And so, Chris, you and Don have given us an excellent debate. So I guess what I'll do is just go over some reminders and announcements for some debates that we have coming up next month. And so, okay, there's a 2 versus 2 debate coming up first thing in April. So we're going to wrap up March the right way. Then first thing in April, we've got a debate on the Immaculate Conception, biblical and ancient, Protestants versus Catholics. I'm excited for this one. It should be good. Turretin Fan and CJ Cox taking on William Elbrecht and Elijah Yassi. If I'm not mistaken, that is...
Okay, I'm awfully sorry.
Okay, that is completely fine. You guys are doing great, and I appreciate your time. So let's go, as Chris called it, lightning round. I like that. So lightning rounds here to wrap things up. All right, so I guess we'll start with this one. I think this is a question for the both of you. So Don, you just had the last word, if I remember correctly. So we'll start with you, and then Chris can have the last word here. Lazarus Conley, $10 super chat. Appreciate it. Question for both. Hosea 13:14. I'll ransom them from the hand of Sheol, death. I'll redeem them from Mot. Not sure. Mot. Canaanite death god. Mot takes body and soul. Why did God lie, only redeeming the soul, and let Mot keep claim to body? Don, we'll start with you.
Oh, well, the point of fact is that physical death is not in the text, as I've already demonstrated. The question itself is pretty prejudicial, and it's based on an awful lot of assumptions, because the death is specifically defined in the text as non-physical death. When Ephraim humbled himself, he was exalted in Israel. When he sinned with Baal, he died. Now, that's the same kind of death of Isaiah chapter 27, in which God says, has he, that is God, struck Israel as he struck those who struck him? Has he slain him as he slew those who slew him? Yes, in measure. How? By sending her or him away. How did God kill Israel? Sending her away. It's not physical death, just like Ezekiel chapter 37 depicts, quote, the whole house of Israel. Where are they? They are in bondage. They're not physically dead, but they are depicted as being in the graves. And so the question itself is completely misguided, because it's overlooking the very definition of death that is found in Hosea chapter 13, verse 1 and 2.
Thank you, Don. Chris, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much to add here, other than that Sheol just is the grave in the Old Testament, and it's the grave from which, or in which, Jesus's body was not allowed to remain, and therein become corrupted. The very language that the New Testament uses, just quoting the Old Testament with David about Jesus's body not being left to Sheol or Hades in the New Testament, is a reference to Jesus's physical body being revived. That was Don's own admission. All the New Testament resurrection language about Jesus is him coming out of the tomb, bodily, physically. So I guess all the language about coming out of Sheol and Hades, and all the language of resurrection and all the language of rising, when all of that refers to Jesus, well, that's about his physical revivification. But don't you think that that's referring to our physical revivification? It means something entirely different for us. That's the answer that you're getting.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks to the both of you. So I think this one's a question for the both. I'm going to assume, because it's not specifying anybody, we'll work through it together. Pittsburgh Joe, $10 super chat. Appreciate it. So he's saying, Jesus said he is the resurrection. Was he saying we resurrect by being in his body? Is he the firstborn of his dead body? Chris, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, so he doesn't just say, I am the resurrection. He also says that those who live for me but die will one day live. And those who live will never die, or more precisely in the Greek, will not die forever. So in the very text, in the very breath with which Jesus calls himself the resurrection, which, by the way, just goes to show that bodily resurrection did happen in the first century, and it's something in which we all participate and by which we are guaranteed our own future resurrection. That resurrection did begin in the first century. It's right there in Jesus's own words, but it's the guarantee of our own future resurrection. So to this question, was he saying we resurrect by being in his body? Is he the firstborn of his dead body? No, he is the resurrection, because it is in him. It is anyone who is united to him will rise just as he did. And again, Don has already admitted that all the New Testament language about Jesus' rising and resurrection is about his physical body coming back to life. So if you want to believe that everywhere the language of resurrection referring to Christ, it refers to the physical body coming back to life, but nowhere that it's referring to his people does it refer to their coming back to physical life, you're certainly welcome to, but that would contradict the very point that Jesus is making in the text being asked about by our questioner.
I appreciate it, Chris. Don, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Well, Chris ever so conveniently ignores the fact that while I made the comment concerning those passages that speak of Christ's resurrection, I pointed out repeatedly that Christ's physical resurrection was a sign of the greater spiritual resurrection. And this is pointed out in a number of different ways. And by the way, he brought up John chapter 11. Jesus said, if a man keep my saying, he will never die forever. Well, in Chris's view, guess what? Chris has that meaning, well, he will die as a result of sin, because the wages of sin is death. So every Christian suffers the direct consequence. Matter of fact, in Chris's view, we're born dead because of Adam's sin. And then somehow or other, we die again when we sin. So
that is not what I believe, by the way. I've never said that.
Okay, I apologize.
Thank you.
You say you do believe we're born dead, right?
No.
Okay. Do we not inherit the death of Adam?
Yeah, that's why we die. But that doesn't mean we're dead now. We're not dead from conception. I think what you're doing is you are assuming that because most Calvinists, and I am a Calvinist, believe that when it says we were dead in our trespasses, that means we were dead from conception because we inherited it. But that's not my view. So just
I appreciate
be careful.
that. I appreciate that clarification. Okay. But the point of fact is, you still believe that we do have to die physically as a result of our own sin, don't we?
We don't have to, because there will be those who are still alive when Christ returns, who he just transforms.
That's evasive.
But to answer no, it's not. You use
the wages
the
of sin is death. Is that correct?
Yes, but death, period. But the whole point of the resurrection is that we are rescued from death. Here's the analogy that I've offered in my journal article that I've gotten published on the substitutionary death of Christ. If you have two people who are in jail awaiting trial for the same crime, and they come out of jail after 6 months in jail, and one of them is found guilty and sent to prison for 2 more years because of the crime that they are found guilty of, and the other person is set free, the person who is set free wasn't punished by being in jail awaiting trial. The fact that he is set free means that he doesn't face that punishment. So just because Christians die doesn't mean they're bearing the punishment of sin, precisely because that death isn't the end for them. But for those that Jesus didn't die for, or if you're not a Calvinist, those who refuse to accept his gift, they will die forever because they have to face those consequences themselves.
I'm sorry, that just seems to fly fully in the face of Romans 6:23. The wages of sin is death.
That's right, and Jesus bore that for us. Yep.
If I die, that's the wage of sin.
No, you're assuming that death there is dying. Paul is not saying the wages of sin is dying, because if it were, then you could come back to life moments later and you'll have paid the consequence of sin. The death that is the consequence of sin is being dead, period. The fact that Christ rose and the fact that we will rise is proof that the fact that we will rise means we don't ultimately bear that punishment. We are rescued from the incarceration that we are in until the resurrection, when we can be judged, found innocent, and go on living forever.
Yeah, I find that horribly evasive.
Well, I know, because of your 70 AD stuff. I get it.
No. That has nothing to do with AD 70. It has to do with the substitutionary death of Christ. If Christ died in our place, and if we are in Christ, we shouldn't die at all, period. No death for those who are in Christ in the power of his substitutionary death.
Well, that's an interesting statement, but there's no reason to think that what you said is true. The fact remains, I'm trying to speak here. The fact remains that when two people are judged, having been incarcerated for a while, and one is found guilty and the other is found innocent, the one who is found innocent did not pay a penalty while he was in jail awaiting trial. And it's this trial language that is used of our resurrection and final judgment. So yes, we die because God has not rendered the mortal immortal yet, but we are rescued from death when we are raised. And so our death was never a penalty to us, but it was something that had to happen until the final judgment, at which point we are taken out of that incarceration and we go on living forever. But the wicked return to that death because death is their punishment, and they refuse to accept Jesus' substitutionary work on their behalf. Now, you can think that flies in the face.
Horribly convoluted, and the fact is, if we sin, that sin brings death. That's the story that's the law of sin and death. So,
gentlemen,
yeah.
No, I appreciate the mini debate we got here on this topic. Very good. We'll move along and get to, I think this might be the last one. Let's see. Another one from 21st Century Mind. $50 super chat. Appreciate the support. And it is for you, Don. And so we'll work through it here. Question is, why did the saints who experienced the restored fellowship fail to prevent the Grecian Alexandrian interpretation of Hebraic metaphor to the church fathers after 70 AD? Christ said many would be deceived, not all of 100% of humanity until Max King. What are your thoughts, Don?
Well, again, let's just go back to the basic undeniable fact that Jesus said the love of the majority would grow cold. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith on the earth? It's a rhetorical question, and it doesn't find a definitive answer. So the question is, that's the vastness of the apostasy that Jesus himself said was going to take place in the first century. Point number two, there was the Hellenization of the first century church, even in the days of Rome, because we find the Gentiles saying that Israel had already been cut off. And in saying that Israel had already been cut off, they were saying that Israel's eschaton had already come and gone. That was Hellenization taking place. And one scholar by the name of Snyder, I can get the quotation and the source for anyone that would like to have it, says that in the early church, at an extremely early time, N.T. Wright says the same thing, Scott McKnight says the same thing, virtually most modern scholars would agree that at an extreme, Richard Hayes especially expounds on this, at an extremely early date with the conversion of the Gentiles, the early church lost its understanding of Hebraic apocalyptic. And this one particular scholar by the name of Snyder says, as a direct result of that Hellenization, there developed a belief in the literalization of apocalyptic, which was never a part of the Hebraic apocalyptic. And so this is just simply a fact recognized by scholarship, that Hellenization of the early church, and by the way, the Hellenization of Judaism took place well before the establishment of the church. That took place during the Maccabean period, and even during the time, obviously, of Alexander the Great. So it's not a question of how or even when the Hellenization took place. It's just simply a fact that we have to, perhaps further study will dig into the nuances of that and to find out why they allowed that to happen. But most assuredly, the Hellenization did take place as more and more Gentiles came into the church. Then the result of that was loss of Jewish understanding.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate it. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually agree with some of what Dr. Preston said. I agree that as Gentiles became the dominant ethnicity within the church, a lot of how the Hebrews understood scriptures was neglected. I actually agree with that. The problem is that Dr. Preston is compressing that into an incredibly short period of time, such that every single Christian writer from the first century on until James Stuart Russell in 1878 gets this wrong. So you've got Paul telling the Ephesians in Ephesians 4:11 that God gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood. And Don says, well, that either was only until AD 70, and then he just stopped giving gifted teachers to the church. Maybe that is his view. Or the Holy Spirit said the Holy Spirit inspired Paul to say that that's what teachers would be doing for the church, and has utterly been failing to do so. The reality is, it is a profound reality that Dr. Preston's first century non-physical resurrection view was utterly unknown, not just to the many, but to the entire Christian church for 1,800 years. And you may think that's an argument from silence, and by you, I mean you, the audience, but it is a deafening silence in light of Paul's promise that the Holy Spirit is giving teachers to the church to build them up. What a poor job the Holy Spirit's been doing for 1,800 years. Thank goodness that people like Joseph Smith and Don Preston and others, Ellen White, have revealed the truth that so many Christians for 1,800 years have gotten wrong.
Thank you, Chris. Don, question was for you, so you get the last word. Go ahead.
Well, once again, Chris can't keep from ridiculing the idea of the great apostasy when the scripture is clear that it did take place. So perhaps he ought to explain to us how it was, since the Holy Spirit was operative in the very first century in a miraculous way, how was it that the very first century church, so incredibly empowered with the miraculous work of the Holy Spirit, how was it that the first century church apostatized? How was it that the church at Corinth, which had virtually all of the miracles, all the power of the Holy Spirit operative in it day by day, and yet Paul, in virtually every single chapter in the book of Corinthians, had to castigate them for error in the church? Was the Holy Spirit failing in his job to teach them? No, they were rejecting what was being taught. Secondly, yeah, they were rejecting it, not because the teaching wasn't there.
Many were rejecting what the apostles were teaching.
Just like the apostasy that was
No, you say all.
I'm talking. It's my
time.
Yeah,
you're right.
My turn.
Okay. Keep pretending that the apostasy was universal when it uses the word of majority. Keep pretending that.
Well, what is the majority? I mean,
it's not 100%.
Majority means majority. It doesn't mean a few. It doesn't mean a handful, and it doesn't mean less than most. It means the majority. That's the very definition. No, that's the very majority. Nobody said every single one, but here's the fact. Undeniable, Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith on the earth? So you must be positing, if you take that text as a yet future reality of the coming Lord.
Said that.
Well, I'm just simply saying, if you did take that text as yet future, then you must posit a yet future apostasy of such vast proportions that Christ would ponder, will there even be any faith on the earth? So while you criticize me for accepting the first century context of the apostasy, as Jesus did in Matthew chapter 24, and I say if again, don't know if you do, but if you were to posit Luke chapter 18 into the future, then you're the one that has to posit a yet future apostasy of that vast proportion.
Everyone watching this debate knows that you've just mischaracterized me, because they know
I asked you to clarify.
And I did. I said the apostasy, you are making the claim the apostasy was so universal that it could cause people, the Christian church, to universally neglect this for 1800 years. My mocking and scoffing at your claim about the apostasy was never about Jesus predicting a great majority apostasy. That was your straw man that you repeatedly erected of me, when in reality, what I was objecting to was this ludicrous notion that it was so universal that nobody saw this for 1800 years until, like Joseph Smith, you found the truth.
Don, and to be fair, we'll give you the last word. Yeah, go ahead, Don, and then
okay. Well, yes, in fact, he has mocked me, and I didn't set up a straw man. I never said that every single person was, apostatized. But all that was necessary was for the dominant Hellenized major writers and figures in the church. They apostatized, and the fact is, I've already pointed out, Chris never addressed it, in Romans chapter 11, there was such a widespread apostasy concerning the role of Israel in eschatology that Paul had to address it because it was overtaking the church. The apostasy was so wide in the church at Corinth that every single chapter contains the apostasy. Galatians chapter 1, I marvel that you are this is a whole region of churches, for crying out loud. I marvel that you are so soon removed from him who called you into grace unto another gospel, which is not another gospel, but there are some who would trouble you. So how widespread was that? Well, it was an entire region. I don't know if it's every single person. I don't have to argue that every single person apostatized to meet the criteria of the love of the majority will grow cold. That's all that I've affirmed. And you can scoff at it all you want, but it's still what the text says.
Okay, gentlemen, that wraps up our epic Q&A. I got to say, that was a very comprehensive Q&A.
That was fun.
That was fun, yes. Some of my favorite parts of these debates are the Q&A, especially with our audience that are always extremely engaged and do their best at sending in some very important on-topic questions. So Chris, Don, you both did a fantastic job. I've really enjoyed this debate. I think it was a debate to remember. It's an important topic, and you didn't let us down. So gentlemen, let's get some real quick final words, final thoughts before we shut it down for the night. So again, I had a lot of fun. You guys did great. True professionals right here. So Chris, why don't we start with you? I guess since you were the affirmative. Again, thank you so much for the time that you've given to us for tonight. Any final words, final thoughts?
Yeah, this. So if you're the viewer and you found compelling the piecing together of dozens of texts to make the case that they're all referring to the exact same thing and there could not possibly be any sort of dual fulfillment, then just know that what you're seeing on my screen right now is what you will have to embrace. You will have to embrace that the spirit-given teachers universally failed the church for 1800 plus years. You'll have to accept Jesus' resurrection body. If it wasn't incinerated when he ascended, it at least was no longer a physical body. It transformed. Despite the fact that all the New Testament language about the resurrection of Christ refers to his physical body coming back to physical life, you'll have to accept that physical bodies are superfluous to human nature, and you'll have to accept that evil, pain, grief, and dying are everlasting realities on this side of death. And if that's the direction you want to go, that's fine, but just be aware that in so doing, you will be accepting a radically different faith than the entire church has professed for 2,000 years. My prayer and my exhortation to those of you watching this is that you will think very carefully about what you are willing to give up if you find yourself attracted by the piecing together of time text that you saw Don do. If you and the ignoring, excuse me, my voice is cracking. Be aware of what you're willing to give up, what you have to give up to accept Don's view, and what you will give up is historic Christianity. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for those final words and final thoughts. Don,
Chris,
you
would you put your chart on parsimony back up, please?
Why?
Because I want to use it.
Which chart? I don't think I included a chart on parsimony.
You just had it up.
That's a list. You want me to put back up?
Yeah, I want that chart on parsimony and the list that you had. Please.
I'm pulling it up. Hold on. Hold your horses, man. So here are the beliefs of hyperpreterism. as a result of giving up the future physical resurrection for a non-physical past.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you putting that back up there. Now, let me close out with this. Chris says, well, if you accept covenant eschatology, this is the disastrous cost to the faith. You're saying spirit-given teachers universally failed. Well, did spirit-given teachers fail in the first century? We know they did. We know that they failed. That is to say, if apostasy proves the failure of the teachers, then the Holy Spirit-driven church leaders in the first century, even the apostles failed, for crying out loud, if Chris's argument has any validity to it. And no, Chris, you're not supposed to be contributing to this, okay?
Well, you are the one who asked me to put up my
That's right.
slide.
And
I'm going to do with my slide what I
your
want to
chart.
do.
You just, you're supposed to bow out here.
Well, gentlemen,
you're the one who wanted my slide up on the screen, man.
Gentlemen, it's probably my fault because when I said final words, final thoughts, I probably should have said no new arguments or anything. Like we're kind of getting an extra debate here, and it's great. I appreciate the passion, lots to discuss. So why don't we, Don, just we'll have you with some final words, final thoughts, maybe a minute, and then we'll just kind of wrap things up.
Okay, well, that's fine. To reiterate what I've already covered, which Chris did not respond to, we have the emphatic statements of Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66, and Revelation chapter 21 and 22, even though there's a lot of figurative language in there, of the reality of ongoing sin, ongoing death outside of the city, outside of the new Jerusalem. And that's the whole point. Now, Chris used that ad hominem argument, well, what, my wife's cancer, and et cetera, thievery and adultery. Okay, it's fine. Doesn't matter. That argument has no probative value whatsoever. It is not an appeal to Scripture. He simply conjured up the argument, and it's nothing but an argument based on emotion. And let me point out again that Chris did nothing but criticize me for throwing all these scriptures together. I concur. I put a lot of scriptures together. Instead, what Chris did is say, I'm going to appeal to 2,000 years of church history. I'm going to appeal to the tradition of the church. I'm going to appeal to the church fathers. And if you reject all that, you're giving up historic Christianity. Well, guess what? In doing so, you're going to accept the testimony of Scripture. So it really comes down, ladies and gentlemen, to a question of, are you going to accept, and I urge you to go back over my presentation in which I demonstrate, number one, what Chris admitted to, and now he denies. I've got his answers right here about what he said concerning the definition of the law of Moses. The law of Moses was the strength of sin. Okay, Don, I'm running late. Okay. So
no, it's okay. Well, I feel like I guess we got an extra closing statement from. Yeah. Are you both feeling fair that you got to make?
Oh yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine.
You? Okay, I just want to make sure you both feel like you've been able to make the necessary points and rebuttals and so on. So I appreciate. Good, awesome. So I think this was an excellent debate. I really enjoyed myself. I do really appreciate the work and time you both have put into preparing for a debate of this magnitude. It really was very thought-provoking, and I appreciate how engaging you both made it. So Chris, Don, again, thank you so much for doing this. I am going to allow you gentlemen out of here. I'm just going to stick around for a couple minutes going over some announcements and reminders. So again, thanks for your time, Chris and Don.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Chris. I've enjoyed this very much. Good night.
Okay. Good night. It's awesome. Okay, well, there we go. Another one in the books. For those that want to see more from our debaters, Chris and also Don, please do check the description box of this video where I have the relevant links there for everybody to check out. This was, I would argue, an epic debate. I've been looking forward to this one, and Chris and Don did not let us down. Thomas Morgan, I appreciate the kind words. He says, much love, SFT. Great work, sir. You know, if it wasn't for the time, the generosity that our guests, our frequent debaters give us, we wouldn't have so many of these awesome debates to examine and also edify us. And I got to say, 3 hours has flown by. The entire debate was very engaging, a lot of information for us to digest and absorb, which means it's one of those debates that requires 2 or 3 rewatches. And so, okay, real quick, and then I'm going to shut this down, as I did quite a few. I did a lot of, I think about 20 to 30 minutes last night of reminders and announcements in terms of what we have going on. And so we'll be wrapping up the week with a couple more shows. Again, I advertised this earlier, so I'll just spend a couple seconds on it. 2-in-1 event, Dr. Dino and Doc duking it out. Lots of people want to see this one, and so it's happening Friday. Last night we had Throwdown in the debate octagon, more accurately probably the debate ring in light of the thumbnail. Dr. Dino, Atheist Jr., tons of fun there. Dispensational salvation. So this is the end game debate between Charles Jennings, David Preston. Did Paul and James teach different gospels? And so this one will be Saturday night. So this is a Saturday night soteriology showdown. Then first thing next week, I am pumped for this one, and I know our evolutionary critics are as well, as this is a challenge event. And so we're going to have Paul Price, Ian Juby, 2 prominent speakers in the world of young earth creation. They'll be here on Tuesday for a presentation on polystrate trees and amazing evidence for young earth, the Genesis flood. And then we're going to have an open mic. So anybody who wants to join, anybody who is critical of what Paul and Ian present, are free to join for some impromptu debate and also some impromptu discussion. Then we'll be in April. And so in April, we got many, I should say, solid debates for you. The Immaculate Conception, April 2nd. And then we've got at least 3 in the world of soteriology. So we got Dr. Robertson Jennis and Chris Morrison. The great salvation debate is justification by faith alone. We've also got the great James 2 debate, Dr. Bob Wilkin and Sean Griffin. And Pastor Tommy McMurtry and A.K. Richardson, they'll be engaging the controversial topic of once saved, always saved. So I'm looking forward to that as well. Guys, this is just an overall snapshot of the material that we have for you over the next couple months. I am currently booking into June, as I do want to make sure that this is a summer to remember that's coming up in terms of debates. And so with that, as I wrap things up, I want to thank everybody again for the feedback in the chat. Lots of positive feedback. Also just the support and the love for what we're doing here. I got to say, Chris and Don gave us a fantastic debate. So again, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for the super chats, the support, the feedback, and also the excellent questions. That question and answer period was awesome. Tons of fantastic questions and discussion from our guests. Okay, thanks for tuning in. God bless all. And Standing for Truth is out.